A 6'3" man, covered in blood, just slammed two security guards into a concrete wall with his bare hands. And nobody in that trauma bay could stop him. Nobody except a 25-year-old nurse who walked straight into the chaos, locked eyes with him through the screaming and the broken glass, and said two words so quiet they barely registered above the alarms. He stopped. 4 trained guards stood there, frozen, watching a young woman in scrubs do what none of them could. What they didn't know, what nobody in that hospital knew, was exactly who she used to be. Before we go any further, if you're new here, hit that subscribe button right now, because this channel is where the stories nobody talks about finally get told. Tap the like button if you want more, and drop a comment with your city or country. I genuinely want to see how far this story travels. Now let's get into it. The call came in at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday in late October, and the Hartwell County Emergency Dispatch Log would later describe it as a critical trauma, unknown origin, male subject, combative. That was the clinical version. The version that actually happened was messier and louder and considerably more frightening. And it began not with a patient, but with a sound, a crash so heavy that Mara Dunlevy heard it from the nurse's station at the far end of the hall and felt it in her back teeth. She'd been charting. She was always charting at that hour, because the 7 p.m. to 7 a.m. shift at Callaway Marsh Medical Center in Denton Falls. Indiana kept her running from the moment she clocked in until the moment the morning crew arrived, smelling like coffee and mild resentment. Denton Falls wasn't a large city population, just under 90,000, the kind of place where people stayed because their parents had stayed, or left because they decided their parents had made the wrong call. Callaway Marsh wasn't a large hospital, either 312 beds, a level 3 trauma designation, and an emergency department that ran on a skeleton crew after midnight and made up for it in sheer intensity. ER saw everything a mid-sized Midwestern city could produce: overdoses, car accidents, farm equipment injuries, domestic calls that the paramedics tried to flag clearly in their notes so the receiving staff would know what they were walking into. And on nights like this one, it saw things that didn't fit any standard category at all. Crash was followed by shouting. Then the overhead alarm, not the code blue, the other one, the security tone that pulsed 3 times and meant something physical was actively happening somewhere in the building, and staff needed to be aware without panicking. Mara was already on her feet before the second pulse finished. She came around the corner of the nurse's station and stopped. Trauma Bay 2 had become something close to a disaster scene in the time it had taken her to cover 30 feet of hallway. A gurney was overturned, its mattress half detached, and lying at an angle against the base of the supply cart. The cart itself had been shoved hard into the wall, not tipped over, shoved, with enough force that the corner of it had left a visible impression in the drywall, and its contents were scattered across the tile. Packets of gauze, irrigation syringes, a blood pressure cuff still attached to its tubing, a pulse oximeter that had cracked open on impact. The overhead fluorescent lights buzzed steadily. Indifferent, 2 of the hospital's overnight security officers were pressed against the far wall. Both of them were large men. Both of them were trained. The taller one had his hands up at chest height, open-palmed, the universal gesture of someone trying very hard not to make whatever was happening in front of him any worse. The second officer was slightly behind the first, one hand on his radio, not calling it in yet, probably because he hadn't decided what to call it. The patient was still on his feet. That alone was remarkable, because the patient should not have been on his feet. Paramedics who'd brought him in had documented a deep laceration to the left shoulder that had bled significantly during transport. 2 suspected fractured ribs on the right side, confirmed by palpation at the scene, blunt trauma to the back of the skull with associated scalp black, and blood pressure numbers low enough that the charge nurse, Patricia Ogle, had already pulled the trauma team paging list when the man had simply sat up, pulled the IV catheter from his own arm without apparent difficulty, and started moving. He was tall, genuinely tall, not the kind of tall that gets compressed by indoor ceilings, but the kind that made the trauma bay feel actively smaller than its floor plan suggested. Broad in the shoulders, jaw set hard, eyes moving fast and with purpose across every exit and every face in the room. He had dark hair matted with dried blood on the left side, and his jacket tactical cut, reinforced at the shoulders. The kind of chest pockets that weren't decorative was torn open at the sleeve and soaked dark from the shoulder wound that was still slowly bleeding. The blood had reached the cuff of his sleeve and was collecting at the edge of his wrist. He wasn't screaming. That was the part nobody in the room seemed to know what to do with. He wasn't swinging randomly, wasn't responding to internal stimuli the way someone in a genuine psychotic episode would. His movements had a quality to them, a control, a deliberateness that the chaos of the room was almost obscuring. He had put those two guards against the wall with enough force that the impact had been audible from the nurse's station, but he hadn't struck either of them. He'd controlled them and stopped. He was looking for something specific, cataloging exits and threats and faces with a speed and efficiency that wasn't the product of adrenaline alone, and he hadn't found whatever he was looking for, and that was the only reason the room was still intact. Mara stood in the doorway and looked at him for approximately 4 seconds. She'd been a combat medic before she was a nurse, not in the way people listed former occupations on resumes as a data point, a line item, a thing that had happened in another life. She had actually been one for 6 years across 2 overseas rotations in environments where the infrastructure for keeping people alive was improvised and unreliable, and where the gap between a good call and a catastrophic one was often measured in seconds rather than minutes. She had learned to read rooms fast because rooms changed fast. She had learned to read people faster still because the person in front of you was almost always the first data point you had before the situation clarified itself into something manageable. What she was reading in Trauma Bay 2 was not a violent man. Not in the way that word actually meant. What she was reading was a man running a threat assessment, live, active, methodical. Eyes on corners, eyes on exits, eyes on faces measuring intent and capability. Body oriented toward the door at a slight angle, weight balanced forward, not the stance of someone who wanted to flee, but of someone prepared to move in any direction on short notice. Breathing controlled, not the shallow, rapid breathing of panic, but the deliberate respiratory pattern of someone who had been trained to manage their own physiology under pressure. He wasn't escalating. He was calibrating. That was a different thing entirely, and it was a thing she knew how to work with. She set her chart tablet down on the counter behind her, slowly, without making a production of it. She reached up and unclipped the overhead alarm panel keypad behind the nurse's station, not shutting anything off, just killing the pulsing tone that was adding noise to an already overloaded situation. Patricia reached for her arm from behind and said, quietly and with real urgency, "Mara, please don't." And Mara kept walking. Security officers saw her coming. The taller one started to say something, a warning, reasonable, well-intentioned, and she shook her head once without breaking to stride and without looking at him directly. She moved to within about 8 feet of the patient and stopped, not directly in his path, not between him and the door, not in a position that cornered him or blocked his best exit option. Off-center, non-confrontational geometry. She'd learned that in training and relearned it in the field and had never once regretted applying it. She waited until his eyes found her. When they did, she held it. Didn't look away. Didn't soften it into something unthreatening. Didn't harden it into a challenge. Just held it steady, the way you held a flashlight beam useful, directional, not aggressive. She said 2 words, quiet enough that only he could really hear them above the background hum, monitors, and the distant recycling of the alarm she hadn't fully silenced. "Look at me," he did. "Stand down." The room went still in the specific way that rooms go still when something has shifted and nobody is certain yet what it shifted into. 2 guards against the wall didn't move. Patricia, behind the station, stopped reaching for her phone. Patient, the man who had moments ago physically repositioned 2 trained officers with the casual efficiency of someone clearing furniture, stood looking at Mara Dunlevy, 25 years old, 5'5" in her sneakers, was wearing scrubs with a coffee stain on the left cuff that she'd been meaning to address since hour 3 of her shift, and something behind his eyes recalibrated. Not went blank, not surrendered. Recalibrated the way a targeting system adjusts when the data changes. He exhaled once, long and deliberate, and the tension across his shoulders dropped measurably. He let her step closer. She raised her right hand slowly and placed 2 fingers on the insides of his wrist. Not grabbing, not restraining. Just contact, the clinical kind, functional, communicating intent through touch rather than words. His pulse was elevated, but not catastrophically so. Checked the shoulder wound visually, without touching it yet. The bleeding had slowed to a seep, which told her the laceration was deep, but had missed anything significant. Good. She could work with that. "I need you to sit down for me," she said. Same register, same controlled calm. Not an order, not quite a request, something in the specific linguistic space between. Can keep watching the door. "I'm not asking you to look away from it. I just need you sitting." He sat. Behind her, someone exhaled audibly. She thought it was probably Patricia. She spent the next 43 minutes in that room, working the case the way she would have worked any serious trauma systematically, without shortcuts, talking him through each step before she took it. His name, per the intake paperwork the paramedics had started in the field, was Jonas Keel. The ID he had on him consisted of a driver's license with that name, a credit card matching it, and nothing else. No insurance card, no emergency contact information, no secondary identification of any kind. He gave his age as 31. When she asked what had happened, he said, "Accident," and offered nothing else. And she made a mental note and didn't pursue it because she'd asked enough questions in enough difficult circumstances to recognize when pressing harder would cost her more than it gained. The shoulder laceration needed irrigation, exploration, and layered closure. The ribs needed imaging. She wanted plain films at minimum, and ideally a CT of the chest to rule out pneumothorax, which, with the mechanism she was hypothesizing, was a real possibility. The head wound needed a CT too, not because of the laceration itself, which was scalp level and manageable, but because the paramedic run sheet noted a period of unresponsiveness at the scene, and unresponsiveness plus head trauma meant concussion was on the differential until imaging said otherwise, and you didn't skip that step, no matter how stable someone appeared in the moment. She started the IV line she needed to replace, drew the labs she needed, and kept talking, not filling silence, but giving him the running commentary that let him track what was happening to his own body. He watched her with the steady attention of someone doing their own assessment. At one point, while she was setting the irrigation, he said, "You're not afraid of me." She didn't look up from what she was doing. "I'm being careful." "That's different." He didn't respond to that. But she noted that his respiratory rate settled by approximately 2 breaths per minute over the following few minutes, which was its own kind of answer. What she didn't tell him was that she was developing a serious and specific unease about what she was observing, not about his behavior, which she had a functional framework for, but about the physical and material evidence she was cataloging as she worked. The jacket was not consumer-grade tactical wear. The wear pattern on it wasn't decorative. The distribution of his injuries didn't match any accident. She could plausibly reconstruct the laceration geometry on his shoulder. Suggested something had caught and dragged rather than impacted cleanly. and the older abrasions on his forearms, partially healed and approximately 10 days old by her estimate, told a story that predated whatever had happened tonight. His baseline physical conditioning was extraordinary in the specific way that came from functional training rather than aesthetic training. His pain tolerance, which she was getting a read on as she worked, was at a level that would have been notable in anyone and was striking in someone who'd just sustained this degree of injury. She filed all of it carefully and kept her face neutral and kept working. The attending on duty was Dr. Franklin Adler, a competent, tired emergency physician 16 years into his career, who had the particular brand of unflappable practicality that the overnight ER tended to either produce or destroy. He arrived in Trauma Bay 20 minutes after the alarm, reviewed her assessment, affirmed the imaging orders she'd already mentally drafted, and added 2 of his own. He looked at the overturned gurney and the damaged supply cart and the 2 security officers who were now standing near the doorway with the slightly unmoored quality of men whose shift had taken an unexpected turn, and he chose not to comment on any of it. "Good call on the head CT," he said to Mara, which was about as close to enthusiastic praise as Adler got at 12:30 in the morning. She was finishing her documentation and preparing to coordinate the imaging transport when the quality of the air in the room changed. She felt it before she identified it, a shift in the ambient pressure of the space, the particular atmospheric adjustment that happened when someone with significant institutional authority entered a room that hadn't been expecting them. She looked up. Dr. Victor Harlan was standing in the doorway of Trauma Bay 2. He was the ER director. He had not been called. He was in street-clothes dark slacks, a collared shirt, a jacket that didn't quite belong to any single context, which meant he'd either been somewhere else in the building, which meant for reasons that weren't clinical, or he'd come in specifically at almost 1 in the morning for this. Mara didn't know which option was more unusual. She'd been at Callaway Marsh for 4 months. Enough time to map the department's dynamics, enough time to understand exactly how Harlan operated, and exactly where she fell in his hierarchy of regard. He was thorough, systematic, and competent in the ways that mattered for administrative purposes. He also had a taxonomy for his nursing staff that was not always explicit, but was consistently applied. Those whose judgment he weighted, and those whose judgment he treated as a variable to be managed. Age, gender, institutional tenure. He didn't state this taxonomy. He didn't need to. It communicated itself through 100 small mechanisms. Who got asked for input? Who got corrected in front of other staff? Who had their clinical observations engaged with, and who had them absorbed in silence and redirected? Mara, 4 months in, had a very clear sense of where she fell. He looked at the patient. He looked at the room. He looked at her with an expression that managed to be simultaneously professional and dismissive. Nurse Dunlevy, he said, always the full title, always with that specific inflection that made it sound like a category rather than a name. I understand we had a security incident this evening. Patient was disoriented on arrival, she said. He's been stable and cooperative for the last 40 minutes. We're coordinating imaging transport. He picked up the paper chart, not the physical chart, which still ran parallel to the electronic record at Callaway Marsh because Harlan preferred it. He looked at it for longer than a casual review required. Who ordered the head CT? Dr. Adler, consistent with the concussion differential from the paramedic notes. He's presenting symptom-free now. The LOC at the scene puts concussion on the differential regardless of current presentation. That's protocol. He looked at her with the flat patience of a man who was accustomed to winning conversations by simply remaining in the room longer than the other party was comfortable with. I'll take over the case from this point. Dr. Adler's managing it, she said, keeping her voice level. Dr. Adler has a department to run. The mildness in his tone was doing significant work. I'm here. I'll take it. There was no technical argument available to her. He was the director. He was senior. She completed her documentation handoff and stepped back, and she walked to the nurse's station. And she told herself this was the appropriate professional response, and she believed maybe 60% of that. She did not leave the floor. Through the glass partition of the station, she watched Harlan spend 7 minutes in Trauma Bay 2. She watched him, the physical chart. She watched him review the physical chart. She watched him speak briefly with Jonas Keel, who appeared to engage minimally with whatever was being said. She watched him write orders, 2 of them, added directly to the paper chart before they went into the system. She pulled the updated orders the moment they appeared in the electronic record. The first restructured the imaging sequence. It didn't cancel the CT, which would have been too legible, but it added a 60-minute stabilization window before transport. The second was a medication order. Lorazepam, 4 milligrams IV push. She read it twice. Then she read the chart notes again to find the behavioral documentation that would justify it. There wasn't any. Not in the last 43 minutes. The last documented behavioral note was her own, time-stamped 11:58 p.m., describing de-escalation and cooperative patient engagement. There was no addendum from Harlan, no new behavioral observation, no agitation flag, no acute anxiety notation, nothing that would constitute a clinical indication for 4 milligrams of IV benzodiazepine in a patient who was currently sitting calmly in a trauma bay answering questions. 4 milligrams was not a small dose. In a patient of his size, tolerances unknown, with a head injury on the differential and blood pressure already on the lower end, it was a sedating dose. A heavily sedating dose. It would take him offline cognitively, communicatively. It would make him difficult to assess. It would make him easy to manage. She stood at the nurse's station for approximately 30 seconds. Then she went to find Sandra Poog, the medication nurse, and explained what she was seeing and explained what she was to her to hold the administration, pending clarification of the indication. Sandra listened with genuine attention and genuine sympathy and said, "You need to take that directly to Harlan, Mara. Can't hold an attending order without his authorization." You know that. She knew that. She found Harlan in the corridor outside the department, finishing a call on his personal phone. She waited until he lowered it. Then she said, "Doctor, Harlan, I had a question about the lorazepam order for Mr. Keel. It stands. He's been cooperative for 40-plus minutes without any pharmacological intervention. I'm not seeing a documented behavioral indication in the chart for minus. He was combative on arrival. He de-escalated. I have that documented with timestamps." He turned to face her fully, then, and the expression he wore was one she'd seen before, not anger, not condescension exactly. Something more like the mild impatience of someone explaining a self-evident thing to someone who was failing to grasp it. "Nurse Dunlevy, you had a good moment in there tonight." Calm. That was good work. He said it like he was setting a plate down carefully. "Now let the attending manage the clinical plan. I'm asking for the documented indication. For my own charting records, the patients evaporated. It didn't become heat, it became something colder and flatter. You're asking me to justify my orders to you. I'm asking for documentation of clinical reasoning. That's a standard. You are 4 months out of orientation." His voice didn't rise. That was almost the worst part of it, that it didn't need to. You had a good moment. Don't overreach it into something it isn't. Felt it hit. She was meant to feel it hit. It was calibrated to land exactly where it landed, in the specific place where inexperience and institutional vulnerability intersected. She held her expression and held his gaze and said steadily, "I'll be documenting my clinical observations and my question about the indication in Mr. Keel's chart for the record." Something moved in his expression then. Not anger. Something more careful than anger. "You'll document your own nursing care. Nothing beyond your scope. Are we clear?" "Yes," she said. She went back to the station. She opened the electronic chart and documented The question she'd raised, the exact response she'd received, the timestamp, the phrasing. She documented the absence of a behavioral indication in the chart. She documented that she had attempted to hold the order and been directed to proceed through the attending. Then she took her small spiral notebook out of her scrubs pocket and wrote it by hand as well. Harlan's exact words, as close to verbatim as she could reconstruct the time, the context. She'd started keeping the notebook in her third week at Callaway Marsh. Not because she'd expected anything specific, because she'd worked in environments where institutional memory was the only accountability mechanism available. And she'd developed the habit in the field with the same deliberate intention she'd developed every other field habit, not from paranoia, from experience. She'd seen what happened when things weren't documented, and she'd seen what happened when documented, and she'd seen what happened when they were, and she had made a simple and permanent choice. She had 41 entries in the notebook. This became the 42nd. 218M, the lorazepam, was administered. Mara was in Trauma Bay 1, managing a construction worker with a badly lacerated hand, the kind of wound that needed patience and careful technique, and a patient who was unfortunately both in significant pain and extremely uncomfortable with the sight of his own blood, which made the procedure more complex than the injury itself warranted. She heard the medications administration through the wall. Essentially, heard the nurse confirm it, and the chart update ping on the station computer, visible through the window, and she could not stop it. And she wrote the time in her notebook later and went back to the lacerated hand. 2:44 a.m., she completed her documentation on the hand laceration, handed off to the receiving nurse, and walked back to check on Jonas Keel. He was sedated deeply, visibly, the kind of sedation that closed the eyes and slowed the breathing and made a person look like a different version of themselves. His vitals were within acceptable range. She checked them herself. Shekla checked the monitoring leads, noted the time of her visit in the chart, noted the imaging still hadn't run, and added a query, professional, specific, phrased in the careful language of clinical follow-up about the 60-minute stabilization when it was a stabilization window, and when it was expected to conclude. She went back to the station. She had 3 other patients active. She worked them. At 3:01 a.m., 2 things happened inside of 40 seconds. The first was a woman appearing at the nurses' station, whom Mara had never seen before. She was in her mid-40s, plain clothes, with the particular self-contained stillness of someone who had been trained to enter unfamiliar rooms without advertising their discomfort. She showed a badge to Patricia Ogle, something compact that Patricia had to lean forward to read. Whatever Patricia read made her straighten up in a specific way and look across the floor toward Mara with an expression that communicated multiple things simultaneously, and none of them simple. Mara was already moving toward the station when the second thing happened. The overhead PA system activated with its 3-tone prefix, and the night dispatcher's voice came through, measured and deliberate, with the slight flatness of someone reading from a prepared script. Attention, all Callaway Marsh Medical Center staff. This facility is entering a security lockdown, effective immediately. All exterior exits are secured. All staff, please remain in your designated areas until further instruction. This is not a drill. Mara looked at the badge the woman had shown Patricia. Even from 8 feet away, the format was readable. The federal format, the specific proportions and color coding that she'd seen before in different contexts in different places. Federal agent. She looked at Trauma Bay 2. At the tactical jacket folded on the text beside the sedated man. Imaging that still hadn't run. At the medication order that had no documented indication. From outside faint, but with the specific character that outdoor sound had when it penetrated the building's insulation, she heard vehicles. Not one, multiple, and not pulling up and stopping, but pulling up and coordinating, doors opening and closing with the overlapping rhythm of an organized deployment rather than an arrival. She reached into her pocket and closed her fingers around the notebook. She'd felt this before, not in a hospital, in a different kind of structure, in a different country, in a vehicle that had gone quiet at the wrong moment, and a radio that had stopped receiving, and scheduled convoy behind them that had not appeared on schedule. She'd learned, in that context, what the convergence of those specific details meant. She looked at the exits. Every lockdown indicator above every exterior door she could see from her position had switched from green to red. Not some of them. Every single one. The federal agent had stopped showing credentials. She was watching Mara with the focused attention of someone who had come into this building looking for something specific and was in the process of deciding whether she'd found it. Mara stood very still for exactly one breath. Then she looked at Trauma Bay 2 again, at the man sedated in the bed, at the jacket, at the monitors tracking his vitals, and something assembled itself in her mind with the cold clarity that she recognized from the field, from the moments when the situation stopped being ambiguous and started being defined. Someone in this hospital had put him under before federal agents could talk to him. The question was whether that was a coincidence or a decision. And the answer to that question mattered more than anything else happening in Callaway Marsh Medical Center at 1 in the morning. Mara Dunlevy pressed her back against the nurse's station counter, notebook in her pocket, lockdown lights red in every direction she looked, and understood with a certainty that settled in her chest like cold water that the night had just changed into something else entirely. Federal agent moved first. She came around the end of the nurse's station with the particular efficiency of someone who had already decided what she was doing before she crossed the room, and she stopped 2 feet from Mara with her badge still visible and her voice low enough that it didn't carry past the two of them. Up close, she was compact, sharp-featured, with dark eyes that were doing the same kind of rapid environmental cataloging that Jonas Keel had been doing 3 hours earlier. Different context, same training signature. "Are you the nurse who managed the patient in Bay 2 on arrival?" she said. "Yes, I need 5 minutes. Somewhere private." Mara looked at Patricia, who was pretending to review something on her monitor with the focused intensity of someone who very much wanted to be somewhere else. Then she looked at the lockdown indicators, still red, all of them, and at the corridor beyond the station, where she could now see, through the department's exterior window, the shapes of vehicles parked along the ambulance bay with their lights off. "Supply room," Mara said. "This way." The agent followed her without comment. Mara pulled the supply room door shut behind them and turned on the overhead light, which was fluorescent and harsh and made the room feel smaller than its square footage justified. Shelving units on 3 walls, IV bags on one side, wound care supplies on the other, a floor scale in the corner that nobody had moved in approximately a decade. The agent positioned herself with her back, not quite to the door-trained habit, same as Mara's. "Special Agent Dara Offen," she said. "I'm with a federal task force operating out of the Indianapolis field office. I'm going to need you to tell me everything you observed with the patient in Bay 2 from the moment of his arrival." Mara looked at her. "What's his real name?" Offen held the pause just long enough to let Mara know. The pause was deliberate. "What makes you think Jonas Keel isn't his real name?" "The ID is too clean. No wear on the license. Credit card has no secondary account markings on the back strip. His gear is military grade. His injuries didn't come from any accident I can reconstruct, and he has older trauma on his forearms that's about 10 days old." Mara kept her voice flat. "Sedation order on him right now has no documented behavioral indication and was written by an attending who wasn't called to the department tonight and arrived in street clothes at 1 in the morning. So, what's his real name?" Offen studied her for a moment with the expression of someone recalibrating an expectation. "Evan Mercer," she said. "Staff Sergeant, Army Special Operations. He's been listed as missing for 19 days. The name landed in the room and sat there. He's the only surviving member of a 4-man extraction team. Often continued. The other 3 were killed during an operation that went wrong, in ways we're still working to document. Mercer survived, went dark, and the next confirmed sighting we had was the 911 call that brought him here tonight. She stopped. The sedation order. Tell me about that, Mara told her. All of it, the sequence. The timing, Harlan's arrival, the conversation in the corridor, the missing indication, the documentation she'd done in both the electronic chart and her notebook. She did it concisely in the order it happened, without editorializing, the same way she'd written reports in the field. Often listened without interrupting, and when Mara finished, she said, "This notebook, do you have it with you?" "Yes." "I'm going to need a copy of everything in it before you leave this building tonight." Mara felt something settle in her chest, not relief exactly. More like the specific sensation of a structure becoming load-bearing. "How long has Harlan been on your radar?" Often's expression shifted in a way that was minimal but readable. "Dr. Harlan is a person of interest in an active federal investigation. Beyond that, I can't give you details right now. What I can tell you is that Mercer being sedated before we could speak with him is a significant problem, and I need to understand who in this building knew he was coming and when." "He wasn't triaged in a way that would have announced his identity," Mara said. The name on the intake was Jonas Keel. How would Harlan have known who he actually was? "That," Often said, "is one of the questions I came here to answer." They stood in the supply room for another 40 seconds that felt longer than they were. Then Often opened the door, and Mara followed her back into the department, and the shift had changed, not visibly, not in any way that Patricia or the remaining night staff would have read from across the floor, but changed nonetheless. The way the quality of light changes when a cloud moves. Something had been named that couldn't be unnamed. Mara went back to her patients. She had 3 active cases, and she worked them methodically, without cutting corners, because the people in those beds had nothing to do with what was happening in Bay 2, and they deserved the same quality of attention they would have gotten on a different night. She checked vitals. She updated charts. She ran a medication administration for a 64-year-old woman with a kidney who was doing the specific kind of suffering that kidney stones produced, and needed both the medication and someone to talk to her like a person. Which Mara did for 4 minutes between other tasks. And she watched Bay 2 through the glass. At 3:29 a.m., Evan Mercer, she was thinking of him by his real name, now, regardless of what the chart said, began to surface from the sedation. It happened gradually, the way it always did with lorazepam, a slow reassembly of alertness that moved through stages. The monitors registered the shift before his face did. Mara noted the time. At 3:41 a.m., Harlan came back. He came in through the department's internal corridor, not from outside, which meant he hadn't left the building during the lockdown. He moved with his usual deliberate pace and stopped at the nurse's station to pull the chart, the electronic one, this time, not the paper, and Mara watched him read through it from 15 feet away. His face gave nothing. He was a man who had spent a professional career managing his own expression in difficult rooms, and it showed. He looked up from the tablet and found Mara looking at him. He crossed the floor to her station. She didn't move. "Patient in Bay 2 is beginning to come around," he said. "I'll be managing the next assessment myself. I don't need you in the room. I'm his primary nurse of record for this shift. I'm reassigning his care to Sandra Puig for the remainder of the night." Mara kept her voice even. "On what basis?" "On the basis that I'm the director of this department and I'm making a staffing adjustment." He tilted his head slightly. "You've had a long night, Nurse Dunlevy. You clearly have a personal investment in this case that isn't serving your objectivity. Sandra will take it from here. I'd like the reassignment documented in the chart." Something behind his eyes tightened by a fraction. "Of course," he said pleasantly. "Everything gets documented." He went toward Bay 2. Mara watched him go, then turned back to her station and opened her notebook under the counter lip. Below the sightline of the security camera, positioned above the station, and wrote the time and the words of the exchange as accurately as she could reconstruct them. She was on her second page. She'd started a new section 3 entries ago, when the entries had begun to feel like they were building towards something rather than simply accumulating. Sandra appeared at her elbow. "Mara, I'm sorry. He told me directly." "I know," Mara said. "It's not your call. Work the case, watch his vitals, and if anything looks off, you find me immediately." Sandra nodded, unhappy, and went. Mara was not supposed to be in Bay 2. She stood at the nurse's station and thought about that for approximately 90 seconds. And then she picked up a supply request form and a pen and walked to the medication room adjacent to Bay 2, which shared a ventilation grate in the upper wall that was old enough and thin enough to transmit sound from the adjacent room at a functional level when the bay's own noise was low. She'd discovered this during her second week. She had not anticipated needing it. Harlan's voice slightly muffled. "You're going to be moved to a private room on the 3rd floor for observation. That's standard procedure for a trauma admission with your injury profile." A pause. Mercer's voice, slower than earlier, still working through the sedation. "I didn't request that. Your condition requires monitoring. It's not elective. I want to speak with someone from my unit. That can be arranged once you're settled upstairs." Smooth. Practiced. The tone of a man managing a variable. "Right now, I need you focused on your recovery. The medication you received earlier was necessary. Didn't consent to sedation." A slight pause. "You were agitated on arrival." The clinical decision? "I wasn't agitated when you gave the order." Mercer's voice had more edge in it now. The sedation was clearing faster than Harlan had probably anticipated, which was what happened when you underestimated someone's tolerance. "I want to talk to the nurse, the one from before. She's been reassigned to other patients. Then I want to talk to whoever is running security tonight." Mara held very still against the wall of the medication room. She filled out 2 lines of the supply form without looking at what she was writing. "I'll pass that along," Harlan said, and his voice had shifted into the register of someone concluding a conversation rather than continuing one. "Rest. We'll have you upstairs within the hour." She heard him exit through the bay door. She wasted 30 seconds, then walked back to the nurse's station by a route that didn't intersect his, and she picked up the desk phone and called the extension for security dispatch. "This is Nurse Dunlevy in the ear. I need you to note for the record that patient Jonas Keel in Trauma Bay 2 has verbally requested contact with hospital security. I'm logging the request at," she checked the clock, 3:53 a.m. The dispatcher noted it. Mara hung up. She wrote it in the notebook. At 4:07 a.m., Agent Offen reappeared at the edge of the department. She wasn't alone this time. There was a man with her, tall, lean, in a jacket that had the same not-quite-civilian quality as Offen's, with a federal credentials badge clipped to his belt. Stayed at the department's threshold while Offen came to Mara directly. "The patient is coming out of sedation," Offen said, keeping her voice under the ambient noise. "We need access." Harlan ordered him transferred to a private room on the 3rd floor. "Within the hour," he said. Offen's expression did something controlled. "He can't do that during an active lockdown without security authorization. Does he know that?" "He's about to." She looked at Mara steadily. "The lockdown is ours. We coordinated with hospital administration to initiate it at 3:1. The exterior is secured by our team. No patient transfers happen without our sign-off." Mara processed that. He doesn't know the lockdown is federal. He knows the building is locked. He doesn't know why or by whom. We wanted to see what he'd do with the information gap. Offen paused. What he did was attempt to move the patient. They stood there for a moment with the weight of that sitting between them. There's something else," Mara said. She reached into her pocket and pulled the notebook out and opened it to the section she'd started in week 3. I've been documenting discrepancies since my 5th week here. Medication orders without clear indications. Verbal instructions from Harlan that didn't match what went into the electronic chart afterward. Patient transfers that seemed to happen faster than clinical need justified. She held it out. 14 weeks, 42 entries as of tonight. Often looked at the notebook. Then she looked at Mara with an expression that Mara couldn't fully categorize. It wasn't surprise, wasn't quite functional than was something more than either. Can I take this? I want it back. You'll get it back. Often took it, careful, and handed it to the agent at the threshold without looking away from Mara. He'll photograph every page and return it in the next 15 minutes. Don't let Harlan or any of his staff know you gave it to us. Mara nodded. One more thing, Often said. The patient, sir, is asking to speak with the nurse from his initial care. We'd like you in that room. Harlan reassigned me off the case. Harlan, Often said, with a flatness that communicated an entire structural reality in a single word, is not going to be determining room access much longer. They went together. Often moved through the department with the quiet authority of someone whose jurisdiction had just expanded, and she spoke briefly with Sandra Poog and told her that the federal investigation required access to the patient and that Sandra's cooperation was appreciated and expected. And Sandra stepped back with the expression of someone relieved to have the decision made for her. Mara went into Bay 2. Mercer was sitting up. The sedation had cleared enough that his eyes were tracking clearly, and he'd pulled himself into the upright position that the bay's adjustable backrest allowed, and he was doing what she recognized now as his baseline state assessing. He looked at her, and something in his face settled by a degree. You came back, he said. His voice was rougher than it had been earlier, the chemical residue of the benzodiazepine still working through his system. I was reassigned, she said. I'm unreassigned now. He almost smiled. It was brief and didn't reach his eyes, but it was there. Who's she? He meant Often. Federal agent. She wants to talk to you. You can talk to me after I know a few things. He looked at Mara directly. The doctor. The one who ordered the sedation. How long has he been doing it? Question landed with a specificity that stopped her. Doing what, exactly? Sedating patients who shouldn't be sedated. Moving them before they can be questioned. Signing off on things that get people out of his department before they become problems. He watched her face. You already know something's wrong with him. I can tell from how you're standing. Often stepped forward. Mr. Mercer, Sergeant, he said. Not unkindly. Sergeant Mercer, I'm Special Agent Dara Often. We've been looking for you for 19 days. I know. You know, she repeated. Careful. I've been moving on purpose. I needed to get to a place where someone would find what I'd left without it disappearing first. He looked around the bay at the walls, the ceiling, the supply cart in the corner. Is this room monitored? We've controlled the camera feed to this bay, Often said. You can speak, he exhaled. And then, in the particular way of someone who has been holding a significant weight for a long time and has finally arrived at the place where setting it as down as possible, he said. The operation that killed my team wasn't a field failure. A setup. Someone fed our extraction route to the people we were extracting from. 3 of my teammates died in an ambush that was waiting for us before we arrived. He stopped. The source of the leak traces back to a network that's been using civilian institutions, hospitals, medical supply chains to move stolen military equipment. Someone in this building is part of that network. I didn't end up here by accident. The room was quiet for long enough that the monitor's steady beep became audible. You came here deliberately, Mara said. I came here because I left something here. Evidence, physical documentation, that I couldn't carry without risk. Planted it 13 months ago when I was brought through this ER under a different name. He looked at her. I needed to get back into this building. Tonight was the opportunity. Injuries are real. I wasn't going to fake something like this, but the location wasn't random. Mara thought about the jacket on the chair. The gear that wasn't consumer grade. The 10-day-old abrasions that predated tonight. You've been in the field for 19 days, setting this up. Running, mostly, but yes. Often had her phone out and was typing. The evidence you planted, where is it? Server room on the basement level. Behind the tertiary data rack, left side, there's a maintenance access panel that hasn't been opened since the infrastructure was upgraded 4 years ago. Put a drive and a sealed document envelope in the wall cavity behind it. He looked it often steadily. It has operational records, communication logs, financial transactions. Enough to establish the network, identify the participants, and connect them to the weapons transfers. Often looked at her partner through the window. He was already moving. How many people in this hospital? Mara asked. Mercer looked at her. More than one. Beyond Harlan, I don't know the full shape of it. That's what the evidence will show. She absorbed that. She thought about 14 weeks of entries in her notebook, about verbal orders that didn't match the electronic chart afterward, about patient transfers that moved faster than clinical need justified, about the patterns she'd been documenting without knowing what they were patterns of, filing them away with the same methodical instinct that had made her useful in the field and inconvenient in this department. She thought about how many patients had moved through Trauma Bay 2 in 14 weeks. And then she thought about something that hadn't surfaced yet, something that had been set at the back of her awareness since the supply room conversation, waiting for the right question to bring it forward. She looked at Mercer. You said someone fed your extraction route to the wrong people. Yes. How did they know you were military? If your ID was sanitized. The network has a medical component, he said. They flag certain patient profiles, injury patterns, physical conditioning, gear indicators. When someone who fits the profile comes through a participating facility, it gets flagged. That's how they identify operators, even when the documents are clean. He paused. That's why the sedation order came so fast tonight. Someone saw the flag and moved. The bay door opened behind Mara. Harlan stood in the doorway. He looked at Offen. He looked at Mercer. He looked at Mara with an expression that had passed through every diplomatic layer it had ever possessed and arrived at something colder and more elemental underneath. This patient is under my care, he said, and his voice was steady, but the steadiness was the wrong kind, the kind that came from control, not composure. Dr. Harlan. Often turned to face him with the particular ease of someone for whom authority in this specific moment was not in question. I'm Special Agent Dara Offen, Federal Task Force out of Indianapolis. This patient is a material witness in an active federal investigation. Your access to this room is suspended effective immediately. A beat. I'm the director of this emergency department. You're also a person of interest in the same investigation. Offen said. Not loudly, not dramatically, just flatly, the way facts are delivered. I'd recommend you stay in the building and make yourself available to my colleagues. Attempting to leave during the lockdown would create complications that I don't think serve either of us. Harlan stood in the doorway for 4 seconds that felt considerably longer. His face went through something not collapse, not panic, just the specific reconfiguration of a man who has just seen the shape of what is coming and is now calculating. Then he stepped back. The door stayed open. Mara watched him go. Her hands were steady. Her breathing was steady. She was aware of a significant internal adrenaline response that she was managing through the same mechanisms she'd used in the field, not suppressing it, channeling it, keeping it out of her face and her hands and her voice while it ran its course. He knows, she said. Yes, Offen said, he knows. He's going to move. If there's anything in this building he needs to access or destroy, he's going to try to do it now, before your team gets to him. Offen was already on her phone. She spoke 3 sentences into it quickly and ended the call. We have people on him. He won't leave the building. Mara looked at Mercer, who had been watching this exchange with the focused attention of someone who had spent a long time in situations where the margin between correct and catastrophic was narrow and every data point mattered. "The drive in the basement," she said. "How long has it been there?" 13 months. "And nobody found it. I hid it well. But if Harlan knows your real identity now, if the network flagged you when you came in, they might know you've been here before. Under a different name. She worked through it. If they cross-reference the dates, they might figure out what you left here and when." Mercer looked at her. Then he looked at Offen. "She's right." Offen was already moving toward the door. Then she stopped. She looked back at Mara with an expression that was the closest thing to unguarded that Mara had seen on her face. "How did you know to keep that notebook?" she said. "Before any of this. Before tonight. What made you start documenting 14 weeks ago?" Mara thought about it for a moment. "About the third week. About a medication order that hadn't matched a verbal instruction, and the reflex that had made her write it down, not a dramatic moment, nothing cinematic about it, just a quiet recognition of a pattern forming, and the choice to track it rather than let it dissolve into the noise of a busy department. Because when something feels wrong," she said, "writing it down is the one thing you can do that nobody can take back." Offen held her gaze for a second. Then she turned and went out the door at a pace that wasn't quite running, and Mara heard her in the corridor, directing her partner toward the basement level, with a specificity that meant the recovery operation was already underway. Mara looked at Mercer. He was watching her again with that same evaluating quality she'd noticed in the first hour reading her, taking stock. There was something else in it now, though. Something that didn't sit entirely in the professional register. "Your name," he said. "Mara Dunlevy. You were military." "Was. How long out?" 14 months. He nodded, slowly, like something was fitting into place. "The way you handled me on arrival. That wasn't nursing school training." "No," she said. "It wasn't." He was quiet for a moment. The monitors beeped. From somewhere outside the department, she heard footsteps moving fast, more than one person, coordinated, headed somewhere with purpose. "The 3 men who died," he said. His voice changed register slightly, became something flatter and more careful. "Team. They have families, wives, kids. They were told it was a training accident. No details, no context, no nothing they could actually hold on to." He stopped. He looked at the wall for a moment, then back at her. "If this evidence is what I think it is, if it establishes what happened and why, they get a real answer." Mara didn't say anything. She knew what it meant to need a real answer. She knew what it meant to lose people in a situation that was then sanitized into something generic and painless and fundamentally dishonest. "It'll be a real answer," she said, because she believed it and because he needed to hear it from someone who understood what she was saying. He nodded. He closed his eyes, briefly, not sleep, just the specific exhaustion of someone who has been running on purpose and adrenaline for 19 days and has finally reached the point where setting down is possible. She checked his vitals. She checked the wound dressing at his shoulder, which had stayed clean. She adjusted the IV rate and noted the time in the electronic chart honestly, accurately, the way she documented everything. She was writing the note when her pager went off. Not her medical pager. The overhead system, the all-staff alert tone, 3 pulses, the same one she'd heard 6 hours ago when Mercer had first come through the door. But the PA voice that followed wasn't the dispatcher's. It was security, the overnight security supervisor, a steady man named Gordon Fells, whom she recognized. "Attention all staff. We have an uncontrolled exit situation on sublevel B. All available security personnel respond immediately to the basement corridor. Repeat sublevel B." Mara looked at the door. Sublevel B was where the server room was, where the maintenance access panel was, where 19 days of running and 3 men's deaths and 14 weeks of careful documentation all converged in a cavity behind a data rack that nobody had opened in 4 years. She looked at Mercer. His eyes were open. He'd heard it. Go, he said. I can't leave you. You're not leaving me. You're going where this needs you. He held her gaze. You know how to move in a situation like this. I know you do. Go. She stood there for 1 second. Then she went. The corridor outside the department was no longer the quiet of a late-night hospital. It had the specific charged quality of a space where multiple urgent things were happening in the same moment. Footsteps from 2 directions, radio traffic audible from security channels, and from the stairwell at the end of the hall, muffled by distance and concrete. The sound of something that might have been a door hitting a wall, or might have been something else entirely. The lockdown lights above every exit were still red. And from the elevator panel 30 feet away, the indicator was showing sublevel B descending, not ascending. And it had been showing that for long enough that whatever was happening down there had already been happening for several minutes before the alert went out. Mara hit the stairwell door and took the stairs 2 at a time. In the specific, controlled way she'd been trained to move fast without losing situational awareness, her hand trailing the rail, not for balance, but for orientation. And she pushed through the sublevel B access door into a corridor that was dimmer than the floors above it and smelled like cold concrete and server heat and something else, something that didn't belong. She stopped. The door to the server room at the end of the corridor was open. It should have been locked. It should have required a key card that only facilities management and IT held. It was open, and the light inside was on, and from where she stood, she could see the edge of one of the data racks, and beyond it, the maintenance access panel on the left wall, and the panel was open. And the cavity behind it was visible, and it was empty. Cavity was empty, and the panel was open, and Mara stood in the corridor doorway for exactly 2 seconds, processing what that meant before her training, overrode the processing, and moved her body forward before her mind had finished the calculation. She went in fast and low, pressing herself against the server room wall to the right of the door rather than walking through the center of it, because walking through the center of an unknown room was how people got hurt, and she had not unlearned that even 14 months out of the field. The server room was long and narrow, 3 rows of racks running parallel to the long wall, cooling units humming steadily along the back. The ambient temperature 5 degrees colder than the corridor. Fluorescent lights all on. No visible movement. She moved to the open panel. Cavity behind it was roughly 18 inches deep and 2 feet wide. The space between the original wall and the retrofit insulation layer that facilities had installed when the server infrastructure was upgraded. It was dry. It had been a good hiding spot. Whatever had been in there was gone. No drive, no envelope, no trace of either, beyond a faint rectangular mark in the dust where something flat had rested for a long time. Crouched and looked at the floor. Scuff marks. Recent, not from the dust pattern. 2 sets of shoes, she thought, different sole widths. One set leading in from the door, stopping at the panel. The second set, less defined, partially overlapping. Stood. She took her phone from her pocket and called Offin's number. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. She called the department number for the ER station. Patricia picked up on the second ring. Patricia, I need you to get a message to Agent Offen immediately. Tell her the server room on sublevel B has been accessed. The evidence is gone. She needs to know right now. Patricia's voice was tight. Mara, something's happening up here. Dr. Harlan, he's not security, is looking for him, and he's not in the department. He was, and then the camera above the east corridor went dark about 9 minutes ago, and when security checked his last location, he was just gone. Mara looked at the open panel, at the scuff marks, the empty cavity. 9 minutes ago. She did the math. Harlan had been in the department, under supervision, or close enough that nobody had flagged an absence. Then a camera went dark deliberate. She was certain, not a malfunction, and he'd moved. And the server room had been accessed in that window. Camera above the east corridor was 3 floors up from sublevel B. Even moving fast, Harlan couldn't have reached the server room, retrieved the contents of the panel, and cleared the space in 9 minutes. Not alone, not without knowing exactly where to go. Someone had already known about the panel. Someone had been here before Harlan disappeared from camera coverage. She pressed her back against the rack and thought about that for a moment, the specific discomfort of a picture that was larger than she'd understood it to be 30 seconds ago. Her phone buzzed, Offen calling back. "The evidence is gone," Mara said before Offen could speak. "Someone accessed the panel before your team got here. Harlan disappeared from camera coverage 9 minutes ago." But often, someone already knew where the panel was. This wasn't improvised. A short silence. "Where are you right now?" "Sublevel B server room." "Get out of that room. Go back to the department floor and don't use the east stairwell." "Why?" "Because we just found the east stairwell door propped open from the outside, and there are people in this building who shouldn't be here." Offen's voice was controlled, but the pace of it had changed. "Move, Dunlevy, now." Mara moved. She took the west stairwell, the one that came up through the radiology wing, and she went up fast with her phone in her hand, and her attention split between the stairs in front of her and the sound of the stairwell above and below. The building around her had a different quality now, not louder, almost quieter. The specific quiet of a space where the normal ambient activity has been suspended, and what's left is something more purposeful and less predictable. She heard, from somewhere above her, on the stairwell, 2 floors up, maybe 3, a door opening and footsteps, and she pressed herself into the wall below the landing and waited, and the footsteps went the other direction and faded. She came out on the main floor through the radiology corridor and walked quickly back toward the ER, and she was passing the patient elevator bank when she heard a sound from behind the second elevator door. Not movement exactly, more like something shifting its weight against a surface, the specific small noise of a large person trying to be still in a confined space. Walking. She didn't slow down, didn't look at the elevator, didn't give any indication she'd heard anything. But she registered it completely and filed it and added it to the architecture of what was happening in this building right now, which was considerably more than a federal lockdown of a hospital in Denton Falls, Indiana. Came back into the ER and went directly to Trauma Bay 2. Mercer was sitting up. He'd managed, somehow, to get his legs over the side of the bed, the injured ribs, making that visibly effortful. Tightness around his eyes that he wasn't voicing, and he was oriented toward the door with the specific posture of someone who had heard the security alert and made a set of decisions about it. "The evidence is gone," she said. "I know." He said it without surprise, which told her he'd already been running the same calculation. Someone already knew where it was. Before tonight. He looked at her. "That means the network identified me 13 months ago when I was here the first time. They found the panel, but they left it. They wanted to see if I'd come back for it. They used it as bait." Yes, his jaw tightened. The whole thing was bait. My coming back here. The flag the network put on my profile when I came through tonight. All of it leads here, to that panel, and now someone has what I planted, and I have nothing. He stopped. Unless. Unless what? He looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't fully read. "I didn't put everything on the drive." She waited. "The most sensitive material, the direct communication logs between the network's internal contact and the defense contractor accounts, I memorized them. 12 document strings. Names, account numbers, transaction dates. Couldn't risk having them in one physical location." He touched the side of his head. "They're here. They've been here for 19 days. You've been carrying the primary evidence in your memory for 19 days. I've been carrying it longer than that. I've been building it for 13 months. From outside the bay came the sound of the east corridor, voices. Movement, not the casual movement of hospital staff, but the directed movement of people who knew where they were going. Mara went to the window and looked through the glass partition. 2 men, neither in hospital staff clothing. One was moving along the corridor wall in a way that suggested familiarity, with camera positions staying below the angle of the dome camera at the east junction, moving in the specific blind spot that only someone who'd studied the layout would know to use. The second man was larger, staying behind the first, carrying something against his right side that his jacket partially concealed. She'd seen enough to know what that shape was. She went back to Mercer. "We need to move. I can move. Your ribs, I've moved with worse." He was already pulling the IV line from his arm controlled, pressing his thumb over the puncture site the way someone who'd done it before would do it, not yanking. Where? She thought fast. The main corridor was compromised. East stairwell was propped open. The elevators where she thought of the sound behind the second elevator door unpredictable. The west stairwell was clear when she'd used it 3 minutes ago, but that window was closing. "Service corridor," she said, behind the radiology wing. There's a maintenance passage that connects to the old storage level and then to the IT infrastructure room on sub 2. It's not on the public floor plan. It's in the original building schematic from the 1987 construction. Facilities uses it for HVAC access. He looked at her. "You know the 1987 building schematic. I got lost my first week. I found a copy of the original blueprints in the facilities manager's office, and I read it because that's what I do when I'm trying to understand a space." She held his gaze. "Can you stand?" He stood. It cost him something she could see it in the quality of his breath, the fraction of a second he spent at the top of the motion stabilizing. But he stood and he was upright, and his eyes were clear. She pulled the backup IV she'd run. She'd started a second saline lock at his right forearm earlier, standard practice for a trauma patient, in case primary access was lost, and capped it rather than removing it. He'd need it later. She grabbed the trauma kit from the wall mount, the portable one, a red nylon bag that contained enough to manage a deteriorating wound in the field for 4 to 6 hours. She didn't ask herself if she was overreacting. She'd been in enough situations to know when she was reading a room correctly. She looked at his shoulder wound. The dressing had held, but the activity was going to stress it. "I need 30 seconds. Take them." She pulled the dressing, assessed the laceration had not reopened. Closure was holding. The surrounding tissue was edematous, but not infected at this stage, and she reinforced it with a pressure wrap from the trauma kit. Fast, competent, not pretty, but functional. He stood still for it, looking at the door. "Done," she said. They went out through the bay's back access, a secondary door that opened into a short utility passage, rather than the main corridor, used primarily for equipment movement. Pulled it closed behind them and went left, away from the sound of the voices she'd heard through the glass. The utility passage connected to the radiology wing service hallway, and from there, the maintenance corridor access was behind a gray door marked Authorized Personnel Vac, that looked like every other utility door in the building and had a standard keyed lock. She had a key. She'd borrowed it from the facilities manager 4 weeks ago to retrieve a blood pressure unit that had gotten staged in the wrong storage area and had never quite gotten around to returning it. She'd been meaning to, she thought, working the key in the lock in the dimness of the service hallway, that the inefficiency of her key returning habits had just become tactically relevant. The door opened. She went through first, checked the corridor concrete, low ceiling, HVAC ducting running along the left side, cold in the way that spaces without human traffic were cold, and waved him through. Pulled the door shut. They moved. Mercer kept pace behind her, and she was aware of his breathing on the right side, not labored, but managed. The kind of breath pattern that meant someone was working to keep their respiration controlled against a pain stimulus. The fractured ribs were a real constraint. Not debilitating, but real. They were going to be in this corridor for any significant length of time. She needed to monitor him. "Straight for 40 feet?" she said quietly, then left at the duct junction. The sub 2 IT room is accessible from there through a grated panel. "What's in the IT room?" network infrastructure, patch panels, and a landline connection that runs on a separate circuit from the main building system. It was installed during the 1987 construction and never decommissioned because it's cheap to maintain. And the IT department uses it as a backup during outages. She paused. If someone has interfered with the main communication systems, which I think they have, based on how controlled this lockdown has been, that line may still be live. He was quiet for a step. You think like a field operative. I think like someone who paid attention to things people assumed I wasn't paying attention to. She turned left at the duct junction. 40 feet. Panels on the right. They covered the distance. The graded access panel was 3 feet square, hinged at the bottom, secured with a simple swing nut fasteners. Crouched and opened it and went through into the IT room, which was exactly what she'd told him. Racks of patch panels, cabling, a workstation that hadn't been actively used in months based on the dust on the keyboard. And on the wall to her left, a beige telephone junction box with a handset hanging from a bracket. Crossed to it and picked up the handset. Dial tone. She exhaled once, let herself feel that for exactly 1 second, and then dialed the emergency federal contact number that often had given her in the supply room, written on the back of a business card that was now in Mara's left pocket. It rang twice. A male voice answered, clipped, professional. Federal operations. This is Mara Dunlevy. I'm a nurse at Callaway Marsh Medical Center in Denton Falls. I'm with Evan Mercer. Agent often has our situation. We're in the sub-2 IT infrastructure room, accessed through the HVAC maintenance corridor. We need extraction, and we need it now. There are at least 2 armed individuals in the building who are not hospital staff or federal personnel. Pause of approximately 4 seconds. Can you confirm Mercer is with you and ambulatory? She looked at Mercer. Can you confirm you're ambulatory, Sergeant? Tell them yes, Wes, and that I have primary evidence in my memory that needs to be documented under protective custody the moment we're out, he said. Told them. There was another pause, longer. We're routing response to your location. Stay off the main corridors. Do not attempt to return to the ER floor. Estimated 8 minutes. 8 minutes was a real number. 8 minutes was workable if nothing changed, and she had stopped, assuming nothing would change approximately 2 hours ago. She hung up. She turned back to Mercer, who had positioned himself with his back to the wall, beside the access panel, upright, controlled, watching the panel opening with the specific attentiveness of someone managing a defensive position. She did a quick visual assessment of him. His color was acceptable. His breathing was the controlled pattern she'd been tracking. The pressure wrap on his shoulder showed no bleed-through. How's the pain? Manageable. On a scale of 1 to 10. He looked at her sideways. 6, you're lying. 7, he said. Possibly 7.5. She reached into the trauma kit and pulled a pre-filled syringe ketorolac. 30 milligrams, non-opioid, wouldn't cloud his cognition. The edge off without affecting your head. May I? He pushed his sleeve up without being asked. She administered it into the saline lock at his right forearm and capped it, put the syringe in the sharp's pocket of the trauma bag. They waited. The IT room hummed with server heat. From beyond the access panel came the sounds of the maintenance corridor. Nothing moving, nothing audible, just the low constant breath of the HVAC system doing its work. At minute 3, Mercer said, "Tell me something." She looked at him. The notebook. 42 entries over 14 weeks. You were doing that before you had any reason to think it would matter. Why that hospital? Why Callaway Marsh? She thought about how to answer that. It was a job. I needed a job. I'd been out of the Army 14 months, and I'd done the transition program, and I had the nursing license, and Callaway Marsh had an opening. She paused. It wasn't a great fit from the start. Harlan made that clear in small ways from the beginning. I probably should have looked for a different position. Instead, I started writing things down. Because it felt wrong. Because it felt wrong, and I didn't know why yet. And writing it down was the one thing I could do that was entirely within my own control. He was quiet for a moment. The hum of the server equipment filled the space between them. The men who died, he said. My team. Reese, Gallagher Park. They had families who were told training accident. Nothing specific, nothing real, nothing they could hold. His voice was even, but there was something underneath it that had the particular weight of something that had been carried a long time in a space with no outlet. This works. If what I have in my head is enough to build from, they get a real account. An official record that says what actually happened. It'll be enough, she said. You don't know that yet. No. But you survived 19 days running across half the Midwest with fractured ribs and a shoulder laceration to get here. That's not nothing. She held his gaze. It'll be enough. He nodded. Not the nod of someone who believed her entirely, but the nod of someone who had decided to accept the possibility and let it function as fuel for the next 8 minutes. She understood that kind of nod. At minute 5, the access panel moved. Not swung open, moved. A slight shift in the hinge, the sound of pressure applied from outside. Testing. Determining if it was secured. Mara put her hand on Mercer's forearm. He was already still. The panel opened. A man came through it low and fast, which was the correct way to come through a small opening, and he came up into a crouch inside the room with something in his right hand before he'd fully registered the 2 people already in there. Compact, dark jacket, not a face she recognized. Mercer moved. It was faster than it should have been possible for someone with his injuries to move, and it wasn't graceful. She could see him absorb the cost of it in the set of his jaw and the specific controlled collapse that happened in his expression. As his right side took the strain, but he put the man against the wall before the man had. Fully processed that there was a target to raise the weapon toward. The weapon, a compact pistol with a suppressor attached, went sideways across the floor. Mara went for it and got it and held it with the institutional familiarity of someone who had handled firearms long enough that the muscle memory was structural, not something she had to think about. Mercer had the man's right arm behind his back and his forearm across the man's shoulder blades. The man tried to move, and Mercer applied pressure in a specific direction, and the man made a sound and stopped moving. He was breathing hard. The ribs were costing him. She could hear it. Stay, she said to the man on the wall, with enough calm that it communicated something about what would happen if he chose otherwise. He stayed. She was still holding the weapon and watching the panel opening when the second man came through. This one was larger and faster, and he came through with the explicit knowledge that there was a problem waiting for him, which meant he didn't hesitate at the opening. He was upright and moving inside 2 seconds, and he was substantially larger than the first man, and his trajectory was toward Mercer, not toward Mara, which meant he'd already done his own assessment of the room. Mara put herself between him and Mercer. She didn't have a plan that was more sophisticated than that. She had a weapon she didn't want to use inside a hospital, in a room with live server equipment, and a man she was responsible for keeping alive. She raised it, and she said, "Stop." Stopped. Not because he was afraid of her specifically. Because the weapon was in the room, and she was holding it without shaking. And sometimes that was enough to create the half-second of uncertainties that changed what happened next. The half-second stretched. From above, from the floor, directly overhead, she heard movement. Multiple sets of feet, coordinated, moving with the specific pattern of people who were going somewhere on purpose with a shared destination. And then the access panel behind the second man blew open. Not gently. Hard, with the impact of a shoulder behind it, and the man stumbled forward 2 steps from the pressure wave. And through the panel came 2 people in tactical vests with federal lettered clearly across the chest, and weapons drawn and voices raised in the specific controlled volume of a room-clearing entry. Federal agents, don't move. Don't move. Hands where I can see them. The larger man dropped to his knees with his hands up. The first man, against the wall, made the same decision, slightly faster. Probably because Mercer's forearm had just redistributed his weight options significantly. Mara lowered the weapon and held it by the grip with 2 fingers, angled away from everyone. The universal gesture of not a threat, and one of the federal agents came to her and took it and looked at her. Dunlevy? Yes. Often sent us. You're clear. Everyone's clear. She let out a breath she'd been holding for approximately 4 minutes. She turned to Mercer, who was still against the wall with the first man, and who, now that the immediate threat had been resolved, was breathing in the shallow, careful pattern of someone whose pain management had just run out of adrenaline to supplement it. Sit down, she said. Sergeant, sit down. He sat. She crouched in front of him and put her fingers on his wrist and counted his pulse elevated, not catastrophically, and looked at his face and read what was there. The shoulder wrap had held. His color was off, but not critically. The ketorolac wasn't going to touch the rib pain adequately now that the adrenaline had metabolized, and she didn't have anything stronger in the trauma kit, but she could manage him to the ER floor where she could. The federal agents had secured both men, Flex, cuffed, separated up against different walls. One of them was on his radio, speaking in quick bursts that she couldn't fully track. Other was at the door of the IT room, looking out. Her phone buzzed. Often. Tell me you're both standing, Often said. Mercer's sitting, by choice. She looked at him. We had company. I know. We're 2 minutes out from your position. The situation on the upper floors is developing. Harlan? A pause. Harlan is not where we expected him to be. We have eyes on him, but the situation is not resolved. What does that mean? It means I need you and Mercer to stay in that room until I'm physically in front of you. Can you do that? Yes. She ended the call and looked at Mercer, who was sitting against the wall with his head back and his eyes forward, and the expression of someone engaged in the specific project of managing significant physical discomfort by sheer determination. She recognized as a method and respected as one. 2 minutes, she said. I heard. He glanced at her. You held a room? I've held rooms before. Not like this. She didn't respond to that because there wasn't anything useful to add to it, and because the specific flatness in his voice suggested he wasn't looking for a response. He was just noting it, recording it the way he recorded things, with the same careful methodology she used in her notebook. She understood that impulse entirely. From the floor above them, through the concrete, came sounds she couldn't fully interpret. Voices. Movement. Something that might have been a door. Often's 2 minutes felt approximate. She opened the trauma kit and checked her supply, counted what she had and what she'd need when they got back to the ER, and what wouldn't wait that long. She did it because doing it was useful, and because her hands needed something to do while the adrenaline cleared and the room settled, and the federal agents at the door watched the corridor. And then one of the agents at the door said, in a voice that had dropped its professional steadiness by a noticeable degree, "We have a problem." She looked up. He was looking at something in the corridor she couldn't see from the floor. He had his weapon raised. His partner had moved to the opposite side of the door. Server room camera just came back online, he said. He wasn't speaking to her. He was speaking into his radio. Someone rerouted it. We've a second active feed, and I'm looking at there's a third subject in this corridor, moving toward our position from the north end. A pause. He's not one of ours. Mara stood. The agent looked at her. Stay back. Who is it? He didn't answer. He was listening to his radio, and whatever he was hearing was changing the quality of his attention in a way that Mara read before his face had time to settle into an expression. They're saying it's a doctor, he said. She already knew the name before he said it. Harlan, the agent confirmed, and he has something in his hand. The agent at the door didn't move back. He held his position with his weapon raised and his shoulder against the doorframe and his radio at his jaw. And the corridor beyond him was the specific kind of quiet that preceded something rather than followed it. Mara looked at Mercer. He was already standing. She hadn't told him to, and she wasn't going to argue it. "What's in his hand?" she said to the agent. "Syringe. Large bore. Can't confirm contents from the camera angle." She knew without confirming. She'd seen the medication room logs. She'd seen the unused potassium chloride vials that had been on Harlan's ordering record, not flagged by pharmacy, because the quantities were individually small and the time frames were spread across different patient accounts. And nobody had been looking at the pattern until she'd started documenting it in a notebook she wasn't supposed to be keeping. A large bore syringe, the drug that stopped a heart in minutes and left trace evidence that deteriorated fast in a compromised body. A death that read as cardiac complication in a trauma patient. Clean, fast, unquestionable in an ER context. She went to the second federal agent, the one who wasn't watching the door. "He's not coming for us," she said. "He's coming for Mercer. If Mercer's dead, the network loses one witness, but they also lose whatever Mercer has in his memory. They know I told often about the notebook. They know the electronic chart has my documentation. But Mercer's testimony is irreplaceable, and Harlan knows that." The agent looked at her. He was younger than she'd clocked initially, with the particular focused alertness of someone running on training, because experience hadn't fully accumulated yet. Often is 90 seconds out. Harlan is closer than 90 seconds. He didn't disagree with that. He turned to his partner at the door and said, "We need to close this position and hold until Offen arrives." "Closing the door puts us in a box," his partner said. "Comes through that panel." "He doesn't know about the panel," Mara said. She was already moving toward it, the small grated access they'd come through, which opened from the outside into the maintenance corridor, and from the inside required deliberate release. Pulled it shut and worked the wing nut from the inside until it was seated. Not locked, but resistant. 2 seconds of resistance in the right moment was worth something. She turned back to the room. Mercer had positioned himself against the sidewall, away from the direct line of the door, not because anyone had told him to, but because he understood geometry and had applied it without being asked. The 2 flex-cuffed men were on the floor. One had gone still with the pragmatic calculation of someone who knew when a situation had passed him. The other was watching the door with an expressions she couldn't read. She watched that one. "Who accessed the panel before we got here?" she said to him. Not loud, not aggressive. The flat tone of a question being asked for information purposes. He looked at her and said nothing. "There were 2 shoe patterns in the dust. You and someone else. Who was the second person?" Still nothing. She filed it. She turned to the agent nearest her. The second person who accessed that panel, it wasn't Harlan. He didn't have time. Someone was down here before the lockdown was fully active, which means they had advanced knowledge of the federal response. That's an internal breach. Someone on your side. The young agent's expression tightened. "That's a significant. I know what it is," she said. "I'm telling you anyway." From the corridor closer now, she heard footsteps. Not the coordinated pattern of a federal team. A single set, deliberate, with the particular rhythm of someone who knew where they were going and wasn't rushing, because rushing looked like panic. And Harlan did not allow himself to look like panic. The agent at the door pressed himself fully behind the frame. His weapon was up. The footsteps stopped, 10 feet out, maybe 12. Harlan's voice came through the door, and it was remarkable, actually, the degree to which it retained its characteristic quality, the managerial calm that had been his primary instrument for 11 years. "I know there are federal personnel in that room. I'm not attempting to evade anyone. I simply want a word with my patient before the situation becomes something that can't be walked back." The agent at the door said nothing. The patient in there is a confused individual with a significant traumatic brain injury. Whatever he's told you tonight should be understood in that clinical context. I've been his treating physician, and I have documented concerns about his cognitive reliabilities. Dr. Harlan. Often's voice came from somewhere further down the corridor behind Harlan's position. Close. She'd made the 90 seconds. Put the syringe on the floor and step away from it. Pause. The footsteps didn't move. I'm not going to ask twice, Offen said. Mara heard the small sound of something being set on concrete. Then a longer pause. Then, in a voice that had finally dropped all of its professional insulation and become something smaller and more elemental underneath, I want to speak with a lawyer. You'll have that opportunity, Offen said. Step toward me. Hands visible. Mara didn't hear what happened next directly. She heard it in sequence, through the closed door. The sounds of a physical compliance that was slower than it should have been, and therefore required more active direction from Offen's team than an immediate compliance would have. Harlan was the kind of man who gave up ground slowly and made sure the giving up was visible, as if the deliberateness of it preserved something. She'd watched him do it all night. She looked at Mercer. He was watching the door with an expression she recognized the specific quality of attention of someone monitoring a threat that is being managed, but has not yet been fully resolved. It's Offen, she said. He's contained. Until he isn't, Mercer said. Not pessimism. Just the field-accurate observation that contained was a condition, not a conclusion. The door opened. Offen came through first, which told Mara something about how she ran her team. She didn't send people into spaces she hadn't evaluated herself. She was breathing slightly harder than normal, and there was a tension around her eyes that hadn't been there in the supply room 3 hours ago. But she was upright, and her weapon was holstered, and she looked at both of them with the specific relief of someone who had run a calculation and gotten the outcome she'd needed. Both of you intact? She said. Functionally, Mercer said. Offen looked at Mara. Mara nodded. Harlan is in custody. He's being transported to the federal holding facility in the county seat, not the local precinct. She moved into the room, assessed the 2 flex-cuffed men on the floor with a glance, and spoke briefly into her radio. 2 of her agents came through the door behind her and took position, clearing the building level by level. 4 additional individuals have been detained on the upper floor's hospital staff, 2 of them clinical, 2 administrative. There's an internal breach, Mara said. Someone on the federal side had advanced knowledge. Panel was accessed before your team reached sub-level B. Offen's expression didn't change by much, but the specific quality of its stillness changed. Tell me what you saw, she told her. All of it, the 2 shoe patterns, the timing, the impossibility of Harlan reaching the server room in the window between his disappearing from the camera coverage and the security alert. Offen listened the same way she'd listened in the supply room, without interruption, and when Mara finished, she stood very still for approximately 4 seconds. That's going to be a separate investigation, she said, and it'll happen. But right now I need to get both of you above ground and Mercer into a secure medical facility where his testimony can be formally documented under protective custody. She looked at Mercer. 12 document strings. Names, accounts, dates. That's what you told Dunlevy. Yes. How certain are you of the accuracy? I've been running them every morning for 19 days, he said. They're accurate. Offen nodded. She turned to her team and started directing the extraction, the 2 detained men to be moved separately, the IT room to be sealed and treated as a secondary evidence site, the access panel to be photographed and processed before anyone else came through it. She did it fast, without visible uncertainty, the way someone ran an operation, when the plan had partially broken down and needed to be rebuilt on the move. Mara picked up the trauma kit. She looked at Mercer. Ready, she said. Past ready, he said. They went up. The hospital looked different above ground, not physically, but in the way that spaces look different when the nature of what's happening in them has fundamentally changed. The lockdown indicators were still red above the exterior doors, but the interior corridors had the controlled aftermath quality of a space that had been a crisis and was now a scene. Federal agents at regular intervals. Yellow evidence tape beginning to appear at doorways she'd walked through 100 times during normal shifts. A facilities manager she recognized standing against the wall outside radiology, looking as though he'd been asked questions he didn't have answers to, and wasn't sure if that was good or bad. Patricia was at the nurse's station. She saw Mara come around the corner, and something in her face, Callistes, collapsed briefly with Bleefer before she pulled it back into the professional register she'd been maintaining through a night that had exceeded the scope of what her nursing license had prepared her for. Mara. She looked at Mercer, at the trauma kit, at the federal agents flanking both of them. "Are you as everything? We're okay?" Mara said. "I need Bay 2 open for reassessment before he's transferred." Bay 2 is there are agents in Bay 2. Then I need 3 square feet and a medication cart. She was already moving. "Bring me the cart, Patricia. Please." Patricia brought the cart. Mara worked Mercer's shoulder wound properly for the first time since the maintenance corridor. The pressure wrap came off. The laceration was assessed in adequate lighting. The wound edges had stayed approximated, and she added a formal closure with steri strips over the existing line because the suturing it properly needed was going to have to wait for a surgical suite with better light and better time. She checked his breath sounds on both sides. The right was diminished, but not absent, consistent with the rib fractures compressing the chest wall mechanics without breaching the pleura. No tension pneumothorax. She'd been monitoring for that silently for the last 2 hours. "You need a CT," she said. "Still, the head injury is still on the differential, and the rib imaging hasn't happened." "I know. I'm putting it in the transfer orders." He looked at her with an expression that was tired in the specific way of someone who had been keeping too many things in motion for too long and had just been given permission to stop. "You're going to follow up on my chart, even after I'm out of this hospital. I'm going to make sure the receiving facility knows what they're looking at." She capped the saline lock and secured the dressing and stripped her gloves. "You presented with a concussion differential, fractured ribs, and a deep shoulder lac. The fact that you've been running an intelligence operation in between doesn't change the clinical picture." He was quiet for a moment. "No," he said. "I don't suppose it does." At 5:44 a.m., less than 6 hours after the crash that had brought Mercer through the doors, Offin's team moved him out of the ER in a transfer that looked, from the outside, like a standard critical patient transport. Stretcher, a paramedic team, 2 vehicles, in addition to the ambulance that anyone watching from the parking structure would have registered as standard escort. He was going to a federal medical facility 2 hours north. His testimony would be formally documented by noon. Mara watched the ambulance leave from the ambulance bay. She was in her scrub still. Her shift had ended at 7 a.m. Technically, on paper, she was off duty. Technically. She had not left. She went back inside. The investigation had moved to its formal phase, and the formal phase had a different texture than the active crisis, more methodical, more paperwork adjacent. More people in suits moving carefully through spaces with cameras and numbered evidence markers. Offen found her at the nurse's station at 6:12 a.m. "Forensic accounting team is already working the financial records," she said. She sat down in the chair across from Mara's position, which was something Mara hadn't seen her do yet sit. It lasted about 40 seconds. "The communications archive on the hospital's administrative server, the one we've been trying to obtain through formal channels for 4 months, became accessible to us at approximately 4:30 this morning. When?" The chief medical officer attempted to delete it. Mara looked up from the chart she'd been completing. Dr. Sloan attempted to delete it. She was in her office at 4:28 a.m., well outside any reasonable clinical need, with a file destruction protocol running on her workstation. Our team intercepted it. The deletion was incomplete. Offen paused. What she was trying to destroy was a communications archive spanning 31 months. connects this hospital's administrative accounts to 3 defense contractor shell companies and to financial transfers associated with stolen military equipment. Mara sat with that for a moment. 31 months. She'd been here 14 weeks. This had been operating for 31 months. How many patients? She said. Often's expression did something careful. That's still being assessed. The pattern, your notebook identified medication orders without documented indication, accelerated transfers, chart discrepancies, we're seeing it in historical records, going back to the beginning of the archive. We're identifying individuals whose records show the pattern and whose outcomes were. She stopped. Adverse. The word sat between them with significant weight. I need you to understand something, Often said. Your documentation, the notebook, the electronic chart entries you made over 14 weeks is currently the most coherent evidentiary thread we have for the period before the archive begins. The forensic team considers it primary evidence. Mara looked at her hands on the desk. She thought about the 3rd week, about the first entry, a small discrepancy, a verbal order that hadn't matched the electronic chart, the kind of thing that could be explained away as a communication error, and probably would have been if she'd let it go. She thought about 42 entries made in the margins of 12-hour shifts, 30 seconds between one patient and the next, documented with the same instinct that had made her useful in the field and inconvenient in this department. It wasn't a sophisticated operation, she said, keeping the notebook. I just wrote things down. That's exactly what made it work, Often said. 7:23 a.m. Dr. Victor Harlan was formally charged. She heard about it through Often, who delivered it in the corridor outside the ER, in the flat, factual manner of someone reading items off a list. Conspiracy to obstruct a federal investigation, falsification of medical records, unlawful administration of a controlled substance, and the charge that had weight beyond the others, the one that made the rest of the list feel like context conspiracy in connection with multiple targeted patient deaths. The syringe he'd been carrying in the maintenance corridor had been analyzed. Potassium chloride, 60 milliequivalents in a hypertonic solution. Enough to stop Mercer's heart within 4 minutes of administration, in his current clinical state. He'd been walking toward the IT room with it. He'd known Mercer was in there. He'd known where they were because someone with access to the federal team's communications had told him, and that someone had also accessed the panel, and that thread was going to take longer to pull than the rest of it. At 9 a.m., federal agents executed a search warrant on the office of Dr. Evelyn Sloan, Chief Medical Officer of Callaway Marsh Medical Center. Mara was at the nurse's station, completing the last of her overdue documentation when it happened, and she heard it as a kind of ambient reporting through Patricia, who was watching the administrative corridor from her position and providing a quiet, continuous narration in the manner of someone who had been awake for too long and was processing shock through detail. They're bringing out boxes, Patricia said. 4, no 5 boxes. And her laptop. And there's a second agent going back in. Mara kept writing. She's coming out. They have her. She's with 2 agents. They're going toward the east exit. A pause. She looks. Patricia stopped. She doesn't look like herself. Mara set down her pen. She looked up at Patricia, who was 61 years old and had been a nurse at Callaway Marsh for 26 years and had spent those years in the ER with the particular toughness of someone who had seen most things and had developed a functional relationship with most of them. Patricia looked at this moment like someone who had seen something she hadn't developed a functional relationship with yet. You okay? Mara said. I've been working under her for 11 years, Patricia said. Not accusatory, just accounting for something. I brought my cases to her when things were unclear. I trusted her review. She stopped again. How many patients did they? I don't know yet, Mara said. We'll know more when the forensic review is complete. There are patients who came through here and didn't. Yes, Mara said. Because Patricia deserved an honest answer, and the honest answer was yes, and softening it wouldn't make it smaller. Patricia was quiet for a moment. Then she straightened in her chair and reached for her own chart stack with the slightly over-deliberate motion of someone choosing to put their hands on work because work was the thing available to put your hands on. I should have seen something, she said. You weren't looking at the pattern. Nobody was, except me, and I didn't know what I was looking at for most of it. You kept a notebook because things felt wrong. That's all it was. Patricia looked at her. That's not all it was, Mara. Mara didn't answer that. She went back to her documentation. At 9:15 a.m., she was called to the hospital administrator's temporary office. The administrator, a man named Douglas Fenn, had been using a conference room since his own office had been designated as a secondary evidence area due to its adjacency to Sloan's. He was a careful bureaucratic man in his early 60s who had been on the phone for most of the last 4 hours and had the voice of someone whose carefully maintained institutional world had just been reorganized around him with very little advance notice. Harlan's disciplinary file against her was on the desk. She hadn't known he'd filed one formally. She'd known he was building toward it the reassignment from Mercer's care, the public correction in front of colleagues, the escalating pattern of documentation challenges, but she hadn't known it had gone to formal file stage. Dr. Harlan filed this 6 days ago, Fenn said. He was not meeting her eyes with ease. It cites professional overreach, failure to follow attending physician direction, and documentation practices outside the nursing scope of care. He paused. In light of the current situation, the board is withdrawing it. Okay, she said, where the board wants to express. He stopped and reorganized himself. The hospital is in an extremely difficult position, and the board is aware that your documentation has been, that it's significant to the investigation, and that your actions throughout this event were. I'm going to stop you, she said, not unkindly. I don't need the board to tell me what my actions were. What I need is to know whether the incident reports I filed over 14 weeks, the ones that went to the charge supervisor and were noted and not escalated, are going to be part of the internal review. He looked at her. Yes, presumably, I need them to be. And I need the review to include the question of why documented clinical discrepancies weren't escalated. Because that's a system failure, and it needs to be in the report, not just the individual actors. She held his gaze. That's what I need. He wrote something on the notepad in front of him. I'll communicate that to the board. She left the conference room and went back to the floor because there were patients on the floor, and she was still a nurse, and they still needed attending to, regardless of what else was happening in the building around them. She picked up a chart from the station, a new admit, a 47-year-old man with a kidney function crisis, and went to work. At 10:38 a.m., Often found her again. She was at the medication cart and waited without interrupting until the administration was complete and charted, which told Mara something about what 4 hours of working together had established. The forensic accounting team has made a connection, Often said. The shell companies that receive transfers from the hospital's administrative accounts, 2 of them are registered to holding entities that trace back to a defense contractor called Velmark Systems. Velmark had a federal supply contract that was under separate investigation for equipment discrepancies. She paused. The weapons that Mercer's team was extracting intel on. The stolen military equipment the network was moving. Velmark is the hub. Mara processed that. Harlan's network wasn't just protecting the hospital's operation. They were protecting Velmark's supply chain. The hospital was a node, a logistics point, medical supply channels that could move certain equipment without triggering standard customs and cargo monitoring. Often's voice was even, but the weight in it was audible. We're talking about a 3-year operation that moved approximately $14 million in stolen military equipment through what looked like standard medical procurement channels. $14 million, 3 years. A network that used a regional hospital in Denton Falls, Indiana as cover. and 42 entries in a spiral notebook that she'd kept because things felt wrong and she'd learned, in a different context, what it cost not to write things down. "There's something else," often said. She looked at Mara with the expression of someone who has been holding a piece of information and has decided the right time to deliver it is now. Mercer's testimony this morning included a detail about his first admission here 13 months ago, the one where he planted the evidence. She paused. He was brought in under the name Carl Varley, blunt head trauma, apparent MVA. He was admitted to the ER and treated initially by the night nurse on duty. Another pause, and then transferred to a private room at the direction of Dr. Harlan, where his sedation was escalated overnight, and where, according to the records, he nearly died from what was documented as a vasovagal response to pain medication. Mara heard that and was very still for a moment. "He nearly died in this hospital 13 months ago," she said. "Yes. Harlan nearly killed him the first time." "Yes." And Mercer survived, understood what had happened, and spent 13 months building a case that could bring the whole structure down. He came back here because he knew the evidence was here, and because often stopped. He told my team this morning that he came back to this specific facility on this specific night, partly because the intelligence indicated the network was preparing to move. They were about to relocate assets and dismantle the hospital connection. He had a narrow window, but also, she looked at Mara with something direct. He said he came back because the pattern he'd been tracking suggested there was someone at this hospital who had been flagging the discrepancies internally. Someone who wasn't part of the network and wasn't looking away. He didn't know who. He just knew the flags were there in the data. Mara looked at the medication cart, at the chart in her hand, at the entry she'd just written precise, honest, time-stamped. He came back partly because of the notebook, she said. Came back partly because of what the notebook represented, often said. Someone who was paying attention, someone who could be trusted with what he knew. She paused. He was right. The ER around them moved at its ordinary pace, the rhythms of a department that had been through an extraordinary night and was nonetheless still a department, still full of people who needed things, still running on the bones of what it was supposed to be before the people running it had made it into something else. Monitors beeped. A nurse at the far station called out a request for a supply restock. PA system announced a routine facility update in the administrator's measured voice. Mara put the chart back in the rack. She looked at the corridor, at the evidence tape still on Harlan's office door, at the federal agent still stationed at the east exit, the morning light coming through the ambulance bay windows and landing on the floor of a department was going to take a long time. That was going to take a long time to understand what had happened inside it. Then her pager went off, not the overhead system. Her individual pager, the patient care one, vibrating against her hip with the specific pattern of a clinical call. She looked at it. Bay 1. New arrival. She clipped the pager back. She looked at Often. "I have a patient," she said. Often nodded. Something in her expression shifted into something that wasn't quite a smile, more like recognition. "Go." Mara went. She was halfway to Bay 1 when the overhead PA clicked on again, not the administrator this time, not the dispatcher, but the hospital's automated system announcing a facility-wide message in the neutral, synthesized voice used for all staff communications. "Attention, all Callaway Marsh Medical Center staff. Effective immediately, Dr. Victor Harlan's administrative access to all clinical systems has been revoked. All medication orders and patient records previously under Dr. Harlan's direct authority are under mandatory secondary review. Staff should refer to the interim clinical director for all questions. Further announcements to follow." She heard it. She kept walking. Bay 1. A woman in her 30s, suspected appendicitis, BP dropping in the specific kind of pain that needed someone's full attention immediately. Mara gloved up and went to her and started working, and for the next 40 minutes the world contracted to the bed and the patient and the monitors and the things that needed to be done and done correctly, which was the work, which had always been the work regardless of everything else. She was finishing her assessment when her phone buzzed. A text from a number she didn't recognize until she read the name above it in the preview and recognized it as one of Often's team members who had taken her contact information in the IT room. The text read, "Forensic team found secondary documentation in Sloan's deleted files. 18 months of records. They're finding names. There are more patients than we thought. Offen says you should know." She read it twice. She put her phone in her pocket. 18 months. More than she'd been counting. More names than the pattern she'd identified had suggested. She stood at the foot of the bed in Bay 1 and breathed once, carefully, and then she went back to her patient because her patient was right there and needed her. But somewhere underneath that, underneath the vitals and the charting and the clinical calculus of a deteriorating appendix, she was already thinking about the names, about what it meant to know they existed and not yet know who they were, about the families who still had the wrong answer to the most important question they'd ever asked, to stepped. And she was thinking about the board meeting that Fen had mentioned, the internal review, the incident reports she'd filed over 14 weeks that had been noted and not escalated, about the system that had looked at her documentation and decided it didn't require escalation, and what that decision had cost. She'd asked Fen to make sure it was in the report. She needed to make sure it was more than in a report. She needed to make sure it couldn't happen again. She was thinking about that, about what that actually required, structurally, procedurally, in the specific mechanics of how a department received and acted on clinical discrepancies between reports when the patient in Bay 1 grabbed her wrist. "You're the one who's been here all night," the woman said. Her voice was pain-ruined but clear. She'd been watching Mara work. "I heard the nurses talking. You're the one who there was something happening here tonight, wasn't there?" Mara looked at her. There was. It's being handled now. "Are you okay?" The question was unexpected enough that Mara took a half-second longer than usual to answer it. "I'm working on it," she said, which was the most honest available answer. The woman nodded, slow, like she understood that, like she'd given that same answer herself at some point, and remembered what it felt like. Mara checked the IVI line and updated the monitor settings and went back to the chart. And she was writing the transfer order for surgical consult when Patricia appeared at the edge of the bay. Mara. She had her phone in her hand, and her expression had the specific quality of someone who has received information they don't know exactly what to do with. "There's a call for you. It's coming through the main desk line. A man, he says he's with the Federal Protective Detail at the transfer facility." She paused. "He says Mercer asked him to call." Mara looked at her. "Mercer asked him to call. He says the patient wanted you to know the CT came back clean. No intracranial bleeding. The concussion differential is cleared." Patricia held out her phone. He said, and I'm quoting, "Tell the nurse she was right about the imaging." Mara took the phone. She put it to her ear and said, "This is Dunlevy." The man on the other end confirmed what Patricia had said, CT negative for intracranial pathology. Rib fractures confirmed, at 2 on the right side, no pneumothorax. Surgical consult for the shoulder lac, scheduled for early afternoon. He delivered it in the efficient manner of a man reading a clinical update on behalf of someone who had asked him to make a phone call. "Is he?" She stopped. "Tell him I received the update, and I'll be adding it to the transfer documentation." He also said, the man paused briefly, like he was checking a note. He said to tell you, the notebook was the whole thing. Tell her that. She stood at the edge of Bay 1 with Patricia's phone in her hand and the morning NR moving around her and the evidence tape on Harlan's door visible at the end of the corridor, and she breathed once and twice. "Tell him it was just good documentation," she said. She handed the phone back to Patricia. She went back to her patient. She had 3 other charts open at the station. and a surgical consult to coordinate, and a full morning shift stretching ahead of her that was not going to accommodate the weight of everything of everything that had happened in the previous 8 hours. And she understood that perfectly, and she went to work anyway, because that was what she did. She was reaching for the first chart when the overhead system clicked on, again. Not the automated voice. A human voice, Fen, the administrator, reading something that had the deliberate cadence of a prepared statement being delivered in real time. Attention all staff. In light of the federal investigation currently active at this facility, the board of directors has voted to appoint an interim clinical oversight committee effective immediately. The committee will include an ex-nursing representative with authority to review all clinical discrepancy reports and mandatory escalation protocols. The board wishes to communicate that all staff who have filed incident reports through existing channels over the past 6 months will be contacted individually for review. She listened to it. She noted the words that were there and the words that weren't. External nursing representative. Mandatory escalation. Individual contact for staff who'd filed reports. It was the beginning of something. Not the whole thing. Beginnings rarely were. She pulled the first chart and started reading. She was 3 lines in when she heard footsteps in the corridor, the quick, purposeful kind, and looked up to see 2 federal agents moving past AER entrance toward the administrative wing, with the specific urgency that meant something had broken open in the last few minutes. She watched them pass. She looked at the evidence tape on Harlan's door. She thought about Sloan's deleted files and the 18 months of names that the forensic team was working through. And then she thought about something. Often had said quietly, in passing, an hour ago, something Mara had registered but not had time to examine. That the internal breach, the person on the federal side who'd had advance knowledge, was a separate investigation. That it would take longer to pull. Longer than what had already happened. Longer than a night. She thought about that. About what longer meant. About who specifically had known enough about the federal response to feed Harlan a location and a timeline. About the fact that the evidence drive was gone and had been accessed by 2 people, and she'd only seen evidence of one of them walking out. She looked at the corridor where the 2 federal agents had just gone. She looked at her chart. She wrote 3 clinical notes, precise and time-stamped, and then she set down her pen, and she looked at the direction the agents had gone. And she understood with the specific cold clarity she'd felt twice tonight already that the shape of this thing was not yet the shape they thought it was. 2 federal agents disappeared around the corner of the administrative corridor, and Mara stood at the nurse's station with her chart. The nurse's station with her chart and her pen and the specific weight of an incomplete picture sitting in. Her chest like a stone that hadn't finished falling. She set the chart down. She thought it through the way she thought through clinical differentials, not jumping to the most dramatic conclusion, but working through what the evidence supported. Panel had been accessed before Harlan's disappeared from camera coverage. 2 shoe patterns. One set she could account for the man Mercer had put against the wall, who was now in federal custody. The second set, partially overlapping, belonged to someone who had come and gone before the first man arrived. Someone who knew where the panel was. Someone who had advanced knowledge of both the physical evidence location and the federal response timeline. She thought about the federal agent who had been at the threshold of Bay 2 when Offen came to retrieve the notebook. The one Offen had handed the notebook to without looking away from Mara. The one who had photographed every page and returned it in 15 minutes. She thought about how Harlan had known they were in the IT room. She thought about the camera above the East Corridor that went dark 9 minutes before the security alert, which was also approximately 9 minutes before Offen's team was supposed to reach sublevel B, which was a window that someone familiar with the federal team's response schedule would have been able to calculate. Picked up her phone and called Offen's number. Offen picked up on the second ring, Dunlevy. The agent who photographed my notebook in the corridor outside Bay 2, Mara said. What's his name? A pause that lasted 2 seconds longer than it should have. Why? Because I've been thinking about the timeline, and I think the breach isn't past tense. I think it's still active, and I think whoever it is knows that we know the panel was accessed early, which means they're going to move before the forensic sweep reaches anything that would identify them. She kept her voice level. What's his name? Another pause. Shorter this time. Special Agent Derek Pollard. He's been with the task force for 7 months. Why him specifically? Because he had the notebook in his possession for 15 minutes and returned it intact. Which means if he was going to use it to identify the panel location, he had enough time. And because he was at the threshold of Bay 2 when you handed it to him, which put him in proximity to Mercer's statement about the drive location. And because the camera that went dark did it in the window between your team arriving at the building and your team reaching sublevel B, which is a window that someone on the inside of the federal response schedule could calculate. Often said nothing for approximately 4 seconds. Stay where you are, she said. Don't repeat this to anyone in this building. I'll be there in 3 minutes. She was there in 2. Came through the ER entrance, moving fast, and went directly to Mara with an expression that had stripped itself of everything that wasn't functional. Where are the 2 agents who just went toward the administrative wing? I don't know. I saw them from the station. Often was on her radio before Mara finished the sentence, speaking in the clipped shorthand of someone issuing a directive they needed followed without discussion. She listened to the response, and whatever came back changed the set of her jaw in a way that confirmed what Mara had already assembled. Pollard just badged out of the administrative evidence room 4 minutes ago, Offens said. He logged it as a bathroom break. He hasn't been located since. She looked at Mara with something that wasn't quite gratitude and wasn't quite professional acknowledgement, but was somewhere between them the specific look of someone who has just been handed information that costs something to receive. You got there before our own internal review did. I was looking at the pattern, Mara said. That's all. It's not all. That's exactly what this entire night has been about. She turned and walked toward the administrative corridor, already issuing directions into her radio, and Mara stood at the ER entrance and watched her go. It took 47 minutes. She was back at her patients in the appendicitis case through to surgical handoff and picking up 2 new charts that the morning had generated when the overhead PA system clicked on with a facility-wide announcement that was not from Fenn and not from the automated system. It was Offen's voice, calm, direct, the voice of a person who understood that a room full of rattled hospital staff needed information delivered without drama. Attention all Callaway Marsh staff. I'm Special Agent Dara Offen. An individual has been apprehended on the hospital's 3rd floor attempting to access a secured evidence area. This individual has been taken into federal custody. The building remains under lockdown, but all clinical areas are fully secure. Staff should continue normal patient care operations. Thank you. The PA clicked off. Patricia looked at Mara across the station. Was that yes? Mara said. Is it over? Mara thought about that. About what over meant for a network that had been running for 31 months through multiple institutions and shell companies and a defense contractor with federal supply contracts. About the 18 months of patient records the forensic team was working through. About the names they hadn't found yet. This part, she said. Yes, Pollard was formally arrested at 11:14 a.m. on the 3rd floor in a stairwell with the evidence drive from the server room panel in his jacket pocket and a burner phone in his hand that the Federal Communications team would later determine had been used to relay Mercer's location to Harlan in real time. He'd been feeding the network's operational contact information about the federal response for 4 months, not long enough to have been the original breach, which went deeper, but long enough to have complicated 3 separate federal operations and to have given Harlan the window he'd needed tonight. Evidence drive was intact. Mercer's planted documentation was intact. Combined with Mercer's memorized testimony, the communications archive from Sloane's attempted deletion and 42 entries from a spiral notebook that Mara got back by early afternoon, the federal case had more evidentiary weight than it needed and less ambiguity than most. Often told her this at 1:30 p.m. in the same supply room where they'd had their first conversation, 12 hours earlier, which felt like a different calendar entirely. They stood in the same positions, often, with her back not quite to the door. Mara with the shelving unit behind her, and often delivered the status update in the same direct manner she'd used throughout. Harlan is going to federal trial. The U.S. Attorney's Office has reviewed the case, and they're not offering a plea arrangement. The evidence is sufficient, and the charges are serious enough that they want a full proceeding. She paused. Sloane is cooperating. She's provided testimony about the network's operational structure in exchange for prosecutorial consideration. Her cooperation doesn't reduce her exposure significantly. The charges are federal, and the evidence against her is independent of her testimony, but it accelerates the broader case. How many patients? Mara said. She'd been waiting to ask this with a specificity she could actually use. Often was quiet for a moment. Forensic Medical Review has identified 11 cases with record patterns consistent with deliberate adverse intervention over the network's operational period. Of those, 7 resulted in patient deaths. The official cause of death in each case was documented as a complication consistent with the patient's presenting condition. She paused. Each of those patients had a military service connection. Background, current status, or family member. Each one fit the profile the network was using to flag potential intelligence risks. 7 people who had come through a hospital and not left it because someone in a position of clinical authority had decided they were inconvenient to someone else's operation. Mara absorbed that number and what it contained and didn't try to make it smaller. Their families, she said. They're being contacted by federal representatives. Each family will receive a formal accounting of what actually happened. The official records will be corrected. Often looked at her directly. Process is starting this week. It's going to take time, and it's going to be hard. And there isn't a version of that information that lands gently. But they'll have the truth, the actual truth. Not a complication, not a documentation error. The truth. Mara thought of Mercer in the IT room, talking about Reese and Gallagher and Park, his voice carrying the specific weight of names that had been carried a long time without anywhere adequate to set them down. She thought about what it meant to grieve someone properly, to know the actual shape of what had happened rather than the sanitized version that institutions produced when the truth was inconvenient. His team, she said, Mercer's team, their records are being corrected as of this morning. The families have been contacted. The operation that killed them is now officially documented as a targeted ambush resulting from an intelligence breach, not a field failure. Often paused. Mercer requested that the correction be made in person to each family by a representative who had the full details of the case. The task force is honoring that request. Mara nodded. She looked at the shelving unit to her, right at the IV bags and the wound care supplies, and the entirely ordinary equipment of a place that was supposed to be about keeping people alive, and had been, for 31 months, also being used as the operational infrastructure for something that did the opposite. The notebook, she said. I want it back. You'll have it. It's been formally entered into evidence, which means there's a copy in federal custody, and the original will be returned to you when the chain of custody process allows. Probably within the week. Often reached into her jacket and pulled out a business card, different from the one she'd given in their first meeting. This one with a handwritten number on the back. It's my direct line, not the task force number. Mine. If you think of anything else, or if anything happens in this building in the coming weeks that feels wrong, you call that. Mara took it. You think this building is going to need monitoring. I think any institution that has operated under this kind of internal compromise for this long is going to have residual effects that a single night of federal action doesn't fully resolve. I think you're the most reliable pair of eyes in this building, and I'd rather have your number in my phone than not. Often held her gaze. Kept that notebook without knowing why it mattered. You held a room in a basement with a man who had classified military intelligence in his memory and a gun pointed in the general direction of both of you. You identified an internal federal breach before our own review team did. She paused. I'm not telling you anything you don't already know about yourself. I'm just making sure someone said it out loud. Mara stood in the supply room with the business card in her hand and the weight of a night that had started at 11:47 p. M. With a crash she'd heard from the nurses' station and had arrived here to this moment through a series of decisions that had each felt small in isolation and had turned out to be something else in aggregate. I'm going back to my patients, she said. I know, often said. And the way she said it communicated something, that this was the right answer, that it was the answer she'd expected, that it was in its own way the most clarifying thing Mara could have said. The formal proceedings moved at the pace. Formal proceedings moved, which was not the pace of a single night, but the pace of an institution processing, something too large to process quickly. In the weeks that followed, Mara worked her shifts and documented her cases and wrote in a new notebook same size, same spiral binding, same habit. And the ER ran the way an ER runs, when the people responsible for corrupting it have been removed and the people who remain are doing the work they were always supposed to be doing. Interim clinical director was a physician named Dr. Abrams, who had been brought in from a hospital in Columbus and who had the particular quality of someone who had taken a difficult assignment and decided to take it seriously. He held a department meeting in his first week and spent most of it listening rather than talking, which told Mara something useful about him. He asked about the incident report process. He asked what barriers staff had encountered when filing clinical concerns. He asked specifically and by name about the reports Mara had filed over weeks 14 that had been received and not escalated. He didn't phrase it as an accusation toward anyone remaining. He phrased it as a structural question, which was the right framing, because structural questions had structural answers. The answer, when it came out over the following 2 weeks of internal review, was that the escalation failure had been administrative a gap in the protocol that allowed charge supervisor discretion on whether to escalate discrepancy reports without a mandatory secondary review, and partly cultural, the specific culture that Harlan had 11 years cultivating, in which questioning his clinical decisions was understood to carry professional consequences. The review documented both findings. It recommended mandatory escalation protocols for all clinical discrepancy reports, regardless of source, and an anonymous reporting pathway that removed the direct supervisor from the initial intake. The board approved both recommendations. Abrams implemented them in week 3. Mara was consulted on the language of the reporting pathway. She sat in a conference room with Abrams and 2 board members and the hospital's legal counsel, and she said, specifically and without apology, that anonymous wasn't enough on its own, that anonymous reporting was a tool, but that the culture that made it necessary was the deeper problem, and that the solution required not just a pathway, but an explicit, documented institutional commitment to non-retaliation that had teeth, meaning defined consequences for retaliation that were enforced rather than theoretical. The legal counsel shifted in her chair. One of the board members looked at his notepad. Abrams said, "What would enforcement look like, in your view?" She told him. Specifically, procedurally, with the same attention to operational detail that she'd used when she was building systems in the field for keeping people alive under imperfect conditions. She had thought about this for 2 weeks, and she had not shown up to this meeting to be general about it. The legal counsel wrote 3 pages of notes. The board member stopped looking at his notepad. The policy that came out of that meeting was not everything she'd wanted. It was more than she'd expected. It included mandatory documented responses to all clinical discrepancy reports within 72 hours, a defined escalation pathway that bypassed the direct supervisor for any report involving an attending physician, and an explicit anti-retaliation clause with HR review triggered automatically for any adverse employment action taken against a staff member within 90 days of a filed report. It wasn't a perfect system. Perfect systems didn't exist. But it had structure, and the structure had accountability built into it, which was the part that mattered. She read the final policy on a Tuesday evening, after her shift, sitting in her car in the parking structure. And she thought about the third week, about the first entry in the original notebook, about the specific, unremarkable moment of writing something down because it felt wrong, and she'd learned, in a different kind of environment, that feeling wrong was data worth collecting. She thought about what it might have changed if the policy had existed 14 weeks earlier. She thought about what it might prevent going forward. She sat with both of those things and didn't try to resolve the distance between them because that distance was real, and collapsing it with easy language would be dishonest. Then she drove home. The federal trial date for Harlan and the co-defendants was set for 7 months out. In the interim, the indictments were public record, which meant they were eventually in the local news, which meant Denton Falls spent approximately 3 weeks being moderately stunned that this had been happening at its regional hospital, and then moved on in the way that communities move on from things that are too large to sustain full attention indefinitely. The stunned phase involved a local news segment that Mara declined to participate in, a hospital board statement that she read once and thought was adequate if not complete, and a series of conversations with colleagues that ranged from genuine to performative, depending on the colleague. Patricia was genuine. She came to Mara on a Wednesday morning before the shift change and said, "I owe you an apology." Mara looked at her. "For what? For the times I told you to take things up with Harlan directly when you flagged something. For the times I essentially told you the system was the system." She was direct about it, the way she was direct about everything without dramatizing it or making it larger than it was, but also without minimizing it. "I was at this hospital for 26 years, and I knew something was off about certain things, and I made the calculation that it wasn't my job to push on it." "You'd been here 4 months, and you kept pushing." She stopped. "I should have backed you earlier." "I didn't. I'm sorry." Mara thought about that for a moment, about what it cost Patricia to say it, not much in the dramatic sense, but something real in the private accounting sense. About the fact that she meant it. "You didn't have the full picture," Mara said. "Neither did you." "No," Mara said. "But I had a notebook." Patricia looked at her, and then, for the first time, in what felt like the length of a very long year, she laughed, not loudly. Not long, but genuinely, with the specific relief of someone who has been in a serious situation for a sustained period and has finally encountered a sentence that permits a real human response. Mara smiled too. It felt unfamiliar and then immediately familiar, like remembering the shape of something she'd used before. 5 weeks after the night of the lockdown, Evan Mercer called her. Not through a federal relay, not through an agent directly, on the phone number she'd given Offin's team in the IT room. Called on a Thursday afternoon, when she was off shift and making coffee and not thinking about anything more complicated than whether she had enough milk. "The families," he said, without preamble, which was how she'd come to understand. He began things. Reese's wife, Gallagher's parents, Park's sister. "They were notified last week. How are they?" He was quiet for a moment. "Gallagher's parents are angry. They have a right to be." Reese's wife, I spoke to her directly yesterday. Cried for most of it, and then she said, "Thank you for coming back for them." He stopped. "That's going to take me a while." "It should," Mara said. "Park's sister asked me to thank whoever documented it." Whoever kept the records that made it possible to build the official account. He paused. I told her about the notebook. Mara looked at her coffee cup. You didn't need to do that. She asked me how it happened. What made the difference? I'm not going to lie to someone who just got the real story of how her brother died after 14 months of being told it was an accident. His voice was steady, but the steadiness was doing work. The notebook. That's the true answer. She didn't argue with that. Because he was right, and arguing with true things was a habit she'd tried to break a long time ago. How are you? She said. A pause. Working. The testimony is complete. The case is built. I'm figuring out what comes after running for 19 days and then handing everything over. He said it plainly, without self-pity, but with the acknowledgement that it was a real transition that didn't have an obvious shape yet. You? Working, she said, figuring out some things about what this place is supposed to be. Is it getting there? She thought about Abrams and the policy and Patricia's apology and the move-in escalation pathway and the board member who'd stopped looking at his notepad. Slowly, she said, yes, good. Another pause. The operation that killed my team, the formal record now says what it was. Going to be used in the training curriculum for evaluating institutional compromise in civilian medical infrastructure. My team's names are in it, not as casualties, as the reason the case was built. Mara stood in her kitchen with her phone and her coffee and the particular weight of that of 3 men whose families had been carrying a wrong answer for 14 months and who now had the right one, and whose names were going into a document that would prevent something instead of just recording it. That's right, she said. That's how it should be. Yes, he said. It is. They talked for 7 more minutes about nothing in particular, the logistics of recovery, the tedium of legal proceedings, a brief disagreement about whether the IV technique she'd used in the maintenance corridor was standard protocol or improvisation, which she maintained was standard, and he maintained showed a flexible relationship with the phrase standard. Was, in its way, the most ordinary conversation she'd had in 6 weeks, and it was exactly what both of them needed. He's said goodbye, and she finished her coffee, and she thought about the conversation for a long time, without landing anywhere specific, which was its own kind of landing. The day she was promoted to the trauma response team was a Tuesday in late December, cold and clear, with the specific quality of winter light that made Denton Falls look like a different city than it was in October. Abrams called her into his office, which was still functioning as the interim clinical director's office, Harlan's old furniture still in it, which Mara had privately decided counted as its own form of institutional irony, and told her that the board had approved position and that she would be the team's junior clinical coordinator, effective the first of the year. She looked at him. On what basis? He looked slightly surprised by the question. On the basis that you demonstrated clinical judgment, procedural competence, and institutional integrity under conditions that would have defeated most people for you. I've been here 5 months, she said. Yes. And in 5 months, you documented a 31-month criminal operation, identified a federal security breach that our own review team missed, kept a material witness alive in a basement during an active armed intrusion, and then came back the next morning and finished your shift. He held her gaze. I'm aware of your tenure. The board is aware of your tenure. Promoting you anyway. She sat with that for a moment. Not the promotion itself, she knew what it meant and what it was worth, but the specific quality of being seen accurately by an institution that had not, for most of her time in it, been doing that. It was an unfamiliar sensation. Not uncomfortable. Just unfamiliar, the way any new pressure felt on a space that had been compressed for a long time. I have a condition, she said. He leaned back slightly. Of course you do. The reporting pathway the board approved, I want a quarterly review written into my role. Not performed by me independently. A formal review with findings reported to the board of whether the pathway is being used and whether escalations are being followed through. Not just whether the policy exists, whether it's actually working. He looked at her for a moment. That's going to create more work for your position than the role description currently includes. I know, she said, for accepting a promotion and immediately asking for more responsibility. I'm accepting a promotion and immediately asking for accountability, she said. Those are different things. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, done, and held out his hand, and she shook it, and that was that. She went back to the floor. She had 2 patients waiting, and the morning had the quality of mornings that were going to be full before they finished. Picked up the first chart and started reading, and began the work of understanding what was in front of her, which was the work which had always been the work, regardless of what else was happening around it. 3 weeks into the new year, she noticed a chart that didn't match. Not a major discrepancy. A medication dose in the electronic record that was slightly outside what the verbal order had specified, easily attributable to a transcription variation. Easily explained, kind of thing that in a different department, in a different year, would have been absorbed into the noise and moved on from without note. The attending was a new physician on Abrams's interim team, a careful woman named Doctor Yates, who had the particular quality of someone who would want to be told about a discrepancy rather than have it quietly corrected. Mara flagged it. She wrote it down. She walked to Yates's current position and said, I have a question about the medication entry on the patient in Bay 3. The verbal order and the electronic record don't match by 4 milligrams. Can we confirm before administration? Yates looked at the chart. She looked at her own note. She said, good catch. The chart is wrong. Let me correct it. She corrected it, initialed the change, and logged the discrepancy as a documentation error for the quality team's monthly review. It took 4 minutes. Nobody's career was implicated. Nothing dramatic happened. Mara wrote it in her notebook anyway, not because it was significant, but because she wrote things down, because things written down existed in a way that things not written down didn't, and because the habit of attention was the foundation that everything else was built on. And she was not going to stop practicing it because things had recently gone well. Put the notebook back in her pocket and went to Bay 3 and knocked twice and pushed through the door and said, good morning. I'm Mara. I'll be your nurse today. Can you tell me what you're here for in your own words? Patient, a 60-year-old man with a specific exhausted look of someone who had been in pain for longer than they'd admitted to anyone, looked at her with the mild suspicion that people directed at medical personnel when they were scared and trying not to show it. My chest, he said. Okay, she said. Tell me about it. Start from the beginning. She listened. She asked the questions that needed asking. She did the assessment methodically and without shortcuts, and documented everything she found in the precise language of someone who understood that documentation was not a bureaucratic formality, but a record that would exist after the conversation ended and might matter to someone at some point in ways she couldn't fully anticipate. Outside the bay, the ER ran at its ordinary pace, loud and particular and imperfect, full of people who needed things and staff who were doing their best to provide them in the compressed and exhausting conditions that the work generated. It was not a fixed place. No institution was. It was a place that could be better or worse, depending on the people in it and the systems they built and the habits they maintained when nobody was measuring whether they maintained them. She had been dismissed here. She had been told she was too new and too young and too inconvenient, told it in the specific way that institutions tell people those things, not always directly. More often through the accumulation of small signals that built into something structural and hard. She had documented it and kept working, and eventually the truth had come out, not because systems automatically corrected themselves, not because institutions were inclined toward honesty without pressure, because she had not looked away from what she was seeing and had not stopped writing it down. She had not done it because she was certain it would matter. She had done it because it was the right thing to do, and the right thing to do existed independently of whether it was going to be recognized or rewarded or vindicated. That was the part that she thought about most in the quiet of the shifts that followed, not the night of the lockdown, not the federal charges, not the promotion. The third week, the first entry, the decision made before any of it had a shape, when the most likely outcome was that she'd fill a notebook with discrepancies that nobody would ever read and move on. She had made the decision anyway. That was the part that mattered. That was the part that had always mattered before the vindication, before the recognition, before anyone told her she was right. The man in Bay 3 was watching her finish, her documentation with the same mildly suspicious attention he'd had since she walked in. "You write a lot," he said. "I document a lot," she said. "There's a difference." He considered that. What's the difference? She thought about how to answer that, about the notebook in her pocket and the one in federal evidence and the 42 entries that had built something out of nothing, or not. Out of nothing. Out of the specific practice of paying attention to things in the small moments before they became large ones. Documenting means you believe what you're seeing is worth recording, she said. It means you think the truth is going to matter somewhere down the line, even if you don't know where yet. He looked at her with the unguarded quality that people sometimes had when they were in pain and tired and far from their usual defenses. "Does it?" he said. "Matter?" She capped her pen. She looked at him steadily. "Yes," she said, "it does." She pulled his chart back up and kept working, and the morning stretched forward into the day, and the day was full and difficult and ordinary in all the ways that mattered, and she was exactly where she was supposed to be, doing exactly what she had always been capable of doing, in a place that was slowly becoming what it should have been, all along. She had never needed anyone to believe she was extraordinary. She had only needed the courage to keep doing the right thing when nobody was watching, and the wisdom to know that nobody watching had never once meant it didn't matter.